Commander Warren Vale pressed his phone against his ear and spoke 3 words into the encrypted line. Send the signal. 200 miles away, buried charges detonated beneath a 6-man SEAL team that trusted him with their lives. He checked his watch, poured himself a glass of water, and waited for the confirmation report. He felt nothing. If you've ever believed that the most dangerous enemy wears a foreign uniform, this story will change everything you thought you knew. Subscribe to our channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The explosion didn't announce itself. There was no warning rumble, no shaking of the earth before the moment. 1 second, the Alaskan night was absolutely silent. The kind of silence that only exists above the tree line in mountain ranges where the wind moves faster than sound and the stars are so close you feel you could reach out and knock them sideways. And then the world came apart. Avery Kane heard the blast before she felt it. A deep compressed percussion, like the earth itself had coughed something up from its core. Then the pressure wave hit the observation ledge where she was lying prone, and the ledge didn't hold. The rock cracked, the frozen soil gave way, and Avery went down into the dark with 60 pounds of gear on her back, and her rifle pressed against her chest like a child holding on to the only thing she was certain was still real. She didn't scream. She didn't have time. The mountain swallowed her. When she regained consciousness, she didn't know if it had been 30 seconds or 30 minutes. Her first instinct, the deeply trained, bone-deep instinct of someone who had spent 11 years learning to survive situations that were designed to kill her, was to take inventory before she moved. She breathed. That was good. Her lungs worked. She moved her right hand. It responded. She moved her left arm, and the pain that followed was immediate and absolute, radiating from her shoulder outward like something had been torn and then reassembled incorrectly. She cataloged it, filed it, and kept moving. Fingers, toes, neck. She turned her head to the left and felt the world tilt badly. The kind of tilt that meant her brain had been knocked against the inside of her skull hard enough to matter. Concussion, possibly severe. She mentally marked it as a variable she would have to work around, not a reason to stop. The dirt above her was packed but not immovable. She started working upward with her right hand, slowly, not because she was being careful, though. She was, but because she had no choice. Her body was providing her with its own set of instructions, and the instructions were clear: slow as alive, fast as dead. It took her almost 9 minutes to claw her way to the surface. She emerged into the Alaskan night with frost in her hair, blood drying along her jawline from a cut she couldn't yet locate, and her NVG unit half destroyed. One lens functioning, one lens dark. She pressed the working monocular against her right eye and turned slowly, taking in the scene below her position. And the scene below her position was a catastrophe. The compound, the old Cold War radar installation they had been briefed on for 11 days, the one that intelligence reports had described as lightly defended, the one that Commander Grant Holloway had called achievable with quiet confidence 3 hours before they inserted, was burning. Fully and completely burning. Not a structure fire that might be contained. Not an explosion that had compromised a single section. The entire facility was ablaze, flames reaching upward through the sub-zero temperature with a kind of furious momentum that told the fire had accelerated help, that something chemical was involved, that someone had planned for this fire to consume everything it touched. She swept the thermal display across the debris field below, looking for movement, looking for the bright orange-white signatures of living bodies moving through the rubble. She found none. Kestrel 1, this is Overwatch. Come in. Her voice came out steadier than she expected it to. She'd trained for that too, trained herself to speak clearly when every other signal her body was sending told her to panic. Static Kestrel 2, this is Overwatch. Come in. Static. Any Kestrel element, any friendly, this is Overwatch. I need a position check. Does anyone copy? The radio returned nothing but white noise. Her long-range communications unit had been destroyed in the collapse. She was working on a short-range handheld, and short-range meant exactly that. She was on a ledge above the valley. Any survivors inside the compound would need to be close, very close to reach her frequency. She stood up slowly, testing her balance, her legs held. Her vision swam for a moment, the way it does when the ground seems to shift sideways while you're standing perfectly still, and she focused hard on a fixed point, a burning section of the communications tower below, until the world steadied itself. Standing orders were clear. She knew them without having to retrieve them from memory. If the mission is compromised, the Overwatch element will hold position, remain concealed, and await rescue or further instruction from command. She had written that herself years ago as part of a training exercise. She had taught those words to younger snipers. She believed in them. She believed in the principle behind them. The logic that said a lone operator, making emotional decisions in the aftermath of a catastrophic event, is more likely to create additional casualties than to resolve existing ones. She stood on the broken ledge, and she believed all of those things. And she looked down at the burning compound, and she began searching the debris field with her thermal scope in a slow, methodical grid pattern, the way she had been trained to do. And that was when she found the heat trail. It was faint. The kind of thermal signature that another person, someone less experienced, someone with a fully functioning NVG setup, maybe someone whose brain wasn't currently filing a formal complaint about the treatment it had just received, might have missed entirely. A fading trace of warmth against the frozen ground, moving away from the eastern edge of the blast site, curving toward the old mining gorge that their operational briefings had marked as a secondary geological feature, irrelevant to the mission, something to be noted and ignored. The trail was moving, or rather the trail had moved, recently enough that the ground still held the ghost of a body temperature pressed against it. Avery followed the trail with her scope, slowly, tracking it as it curved east. And at the edge of the thermal image, half buried beneath a section of collapsed fencing, she found something else. A piece of equipment, small, rectangular, still putting out the faintest ghost of electronic warmth, which meant its battery was still alive, barely clinging to the last of its charge, the way a drowning person clings to something that might not hold. She recognized the shape immediately. She had spent 11 days looking at an identical unit on the briefing room table, while Holloway talked through contingencies. It was a fragment of Commander Holloway's encrypted mission beacon, broken, but still there, and 3 feet from the beacon, dark against the frost, were drops of blood, fresh blood, still not fully frozen, which meant it had been shed within the last few minutes. Avery stared at those drops for a long moment. She did the math that the situation required her to do. She calculated the distance to the mining gorge. She calculated the temperature, falling hard now, with the storm system she had watched building on the weather displays during their insertion approaching from the northwest. She calculated the time until the rescue helicopter force could reach her position. Almost 3 hours minimum, assuming the storm didn't push them back further. She calculated the window of time in which anyone who had been pulled from that blast site and dragged toward that gorge while injured would still be alive. The numbers did not favor waiting. She stood on that broken ledge and heard Holloway's voice in her mind, the voice from the final pre-mission briefing, the one he had given standing at the head of the table, with his arms crossed and his jaw set in that particular way. That meant he was choosing his words very carefully. No heroics, he had said. We bring everyone home. That's the mission. Everything else is noise. And she had agreed with him. She had believed him. She believed him now. Then I'm bringing you home, she said quietly, to the empty valley, to the burning compound below, to the heat trail that was already fading. That's what I'm doing. She slung the rifle over her right shoulder, protecting her left, and began her descent. She moved through the destroyed compound with discipline, not desperation. There was a difference, and she knew it, and she made herself feel the difference in the pace of her footsteps, in the deliberateness of each route choice. She was not running. She was not reacting. She was working. What she found in the compound changed the nature of what she understood herself to be dealing with. The explosion had not been an accident. She identified the charge placement within the first 3 minutes of her examination. Small-shaped charges, military grade, placed at exact intervals beneath the floor of the main approach corridor, the exact corridor that SEAL Team Kestrel had used to enter the facility. Not placed broadly, not placed to destroy the building itself. Placed with surgical precision, designed to eliminate a specific group of people moving through a specific path. Someone had known their route. Someone had known their arrival time. Someone had known which corridor they would use, and in what order, and at what moment they would be most exposed. She went still with that knowledge for exactly 4 seconds. Then she kept moving, because the implications of what she had discovered were too significant to process on their feet, and she needed to locate survivors before she could afford to think about anything else. She found 2 sites where the blast had been immediately fatal, and she marked both locations with IR strobes from the supply cache she carried in her vest the rescue team would need to know. She also found 3 other areas where the debris fall pattern suggested someone might have been shielded from the primary explosion. and she marked those too. She didn't know if anyone was alive beneath them. She wasn't going to assume they weren't. She was crouched behind a collapsed wall section, examining the debris for the third sight, when she heard them. Boots. Multiple sets. Moving with the casual confidence of people who own the ground they were walking on. She pressed herself into the shadow of the wall and counted. 7, 8 Northern Dawn security, moving in a sweep pattern, flashlights cutting through the smoke in the pre-dawn dark. Cleanup crew, which meant they expected survivors, which meant they had done this before. Avery had been trained to fight. She had also been trained to know the difference between a fight she could win and a fight that would accomplish nothing except getting her killed. 8 armed men in an environment they controlled against one injured sniper with compromised vision and a shoulder that was already sending her detailed reports about its unhappiness. That was not a fight. That was a problem to be solved differently. She moved through the ruins using everything the environment gave her. Smoke for concealment, broken structures for cover, the noise of the patrol's own movement to mask the sound of hers. She worked around the perimeter of their sweep, and she was almost clear of them almost. The way that particular word contains entire universes of tension when one of the guards drifted off the main patrol line and came directly toward the section of wall she was using for cover. She heard him before she saw him. Heard the change in his footsteps, the slight pause that meant he was looking at something, evaluating something. He had seen something, maybe a disturbed patch of frost where she had crawled, maybe the faint IR glow from one of her strobes, if he happened to be wearing any kind of optical enhancement. Whatever it was, he was coming toward it. She made herself wait. Waiting is the hardest thing. Every instinct says move, act, respond. Training says wait, evaluate, respond to what is actually happening, rather than what you fear might happen. He came around the corner of the wall and she was already moving, using the same fluid economy of motion that years of close-quarters training had built into her reflexes. It was brief and it was controlled and it was not clean, because nothing is clean when your shoulder has been rearranged and your vision is doubling, and you're trying not to make a sound in a situation that doesn't particularly care about your physical limitations. She won the confrontation. The cost was real. Her shoulder went somewhere it was not supposed to go and came back again in a way that made her vision gray at the edges and forced her to bite down on a sound that would have brought the rest of the patrol running. She took 3 deep, controlled breaths and let the gray recede and went back to work. What she found on the patrol leader changed everything again. A handheld radio, military-grade encryption, but the frequencies he had been monitoring were clearly Northern Dawn internal comms. She listened for 90 seconds, scanning through the active channels, and what she heard in those 90 seconds gave her a direction, a timeline, and a name she hadn't expected. Commander Holloway was alive. The voice on the radio calm, professional, someone in an authority position was giving instructions. The prisoner was to be transported to the main shaft of Black Ridge Mine before dawn. Creed himself wanted the interrogation. The module would be read, the information extracted, and then the commander would be moved through the mining tunnel to the eastern airstrip for transport. Shepard had confirmed the extraction window. Shepard. She hadn't heard that name in the 11 days of briefing. It wasn't in the operational documentation. It wasn't on any of the personnel records for Northern Dawn that intelligence had provided. But the voice on the radio said it like a title, like a rank, like a person everyone on the channel already knew. She pocketed the radio, rechecked her ammunition. Too little, not enough, never enough, and followed the blood trail east toward the gorge. The gorge was different from the compound. The compound had been catastrophic and immediate. The gorge was slow and patient and relentless in the way that the Alaskan wilderness is relentless, which is to say it applied pressure with no personal investment in the outcome. It simply existed, and it was cold, and it was dark, and the trail she was following was sometimes clear and sometimes invisible, and twice she lost it entirely and had to stop and work her way backward and find it again. And once she came within 18 inches of stepping through a snow-covered mineshaft opening that dropped into absolute dark below. Her concussion was not improving. That was the honest assessment she made of her own condition. Approximately 40 minutes into the gorge crossing, the double vision was becoming a regular visitor rather than an occasional one. There were gaps, small, frightening gaps in her recent memory, moments where she would be in one position and then, with no clear transition, in another, with no accounting for the time between them. She didn't know if those gaps were seconds or minutes. She dealt with it the way she dealt with all variables she couldn't control. She cataloged it, accepted it as the terrain she was navigating, and kept moving. And moving through those gaps, something else was happening. The gorge and the cold and the incomplete vision were pulling memories to the surface the way cold weather sometimes pulls old injuries back to painful prominence. 2 years earlier, a different mountain range, a different hemisphere, a mission that had gone wrong in a different way, with a different kind of damage. She had been in an overwatch position. The instruction had been clear: hold position, await extraction, do not move on the target. And she had held the position. She had done exactly what she was told. She had lain on a hillside and watched a heat signature on her thermal display and waited and waited and waited until the extraction came. And by the time the extraction came, the heat signature had gone cold. His name was Daniels, 24 years old, from Georgia. He had been alive when she spotted him. She was 70% certain of that, maybe 80. The review had cleared her. The commanding officers had agreed, in writing, in official language, that she had followed orders correctly and that the outcome was not the result of any decision she had made. She had never fully believed them. Holloway had known that. She didn't know how he knew, whether someone had told him, whether he had simply read it in the way she carried herself at the beginning, before she had learned to carry it differently. But he had known, and one evening, midway through a deployment that had been brutal in the specific way that deployments can be brutal, without involving any particular dramatic incident, he had sat down across from her in the field mess and said, without preamble or gentleness, "You know the difference between reckless and responsible, Kane. The problem is you've decided that caution and cowardice are the same thing, and they are absolutely not." She had wanted to argue. She hadn't had an argument that held up. "Daniels wasn't your fault," he had continued. "And I'm not saying that to make you feel better. I'm saying it because it's operationally accurate, and you know it, and you need to stop using his memory as a reason to never trust your own judgment again." She thought about that conversation now, picking her way through the frozen gorge, one functional eye on the trail, the other giving her a shadow image that was beginning to feel less like useful information and more like interference. She had not disobeyed an order out of emotion. She had evaluated the situation as it existed, not as it had been briefed. She had identified new information: the heat trail, the beacon fragment, the blood. She had made a decision based on that new information, the same way she had been trained to do. And then she found something that confirmed she had made the right call. On a low branch at eye level, barely visible even in the thin light of her working NVG lens, a strip of medical tape, white against dark bark. Not accidental. Medical tape doesn't blow into trees. Someone had placed it. 3 feet further along the trail, in the frozen mud along the path's edge, a boot print, pointing left, toward an alternate route that ran parallel to the main gorge trail, higher up, protected from observation from below, and pressed into a patch of ice near the base of a rock formation. Marks. Deliberate marks, not random fractures in the ice. She had to crouch and angle her lens to read them, and what she read made her breath come out in a long, visible cloud against the cold air. 3 letters, 2 words, scratched into the ice with something pointed: a blade, maybe, or a buckle, worked carefully in a moment when the person doing it didn't have much time and knew it. 3 inside, airstrip east, trust no comms. She stared at the message for a long moment. Holloway was not only alive. Holloway was conscious, functional enough to be thinking tactically, and he had left her a trail. He had known someone would come for him. He had known or hoped, and he had started working to help them the moment he had the chance. He had left this for her. She stood up and pushed on at a communications relay shack bolted to the rock face above the gorge-old equipment, Cold War vintage, the kind that still worked because it had been built to survive conditions that were meant to break more sophisticated things. She found a signal jammer. It was military-grade hardware, well-maintained, recently placed. It explained the silence from her radio, the absence of any response from Kestrel elements at the compound. It explained why she had been completely unable to raise Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, despite being on the correct frequencies. She disabled it. It took 4 minutes and cost her the use of a multi-tool she wasn't sure she'd see again, but she got it down and she got a signal, and she reached Elmendorf on the emergency frequency and began transmitting. She gave her position. She gave Holloway's last known direction. She gave the mine designation from her briefing notes: Black Ridge, Eastern Gorge Sector. She asked for immediate air support and a QRF movement, with the specific instruction that they should approach from the south. away from the airstrip she had been told was east of the mine. And then the radio gave her a response she hadn't expected. The voice was calm, authoritative, speaking with the comfortable confidence of someone who had rank and used it routinely. It used her name, her actual name, not her call sign, which was not in any emergency broadcast protocol she had ever seen. Kane, this is command element. Abort pursuit. Return to original position and await extraction. She went completely still. Who is this? She asked. I said abort pursuit, Kane. You've got a concussion and a compromised team situation. You're making emotional decisions. Return to the blast site and wait. She looked at the radio in her hand. She thought about the words the voice had just used. She thought about what was wrong with those words. Then she realized she had never told command she was pursuing anything. She had never transmitted a direction. She had never reported her injuries. The voice knew she had a concussion. The voice knew she was in pursuit mode. The voice knew things that she had never transmitted, which meant the voice had been listening to her, tracking her, monitoring her communications through a channel that was supposed to be secure. The voice knew exactly where she was and what she was doing, and the voice wanted her to stop. Authenticate, she said. Give me the day code. A pause. Brief. But there, this is a direct order. Give me the day code, she said again, and her voice was completely flat, completely steady, the same tone she used at the range when she was working through a problem that required her full concentration. Another pause, longer this time. The voice didn't give the code. Instead, it shifted slightly, the smallest audible change in approach, barely perceptible. The kind of change you would only catch if you had spent years listening to people try to talk their way through things they couldn't actually support. You're in over your head, the voice said. Come back. Avery stared at the radio. And then she did something she had never done in 11 years of service. She reached down, found the battery compartment on the back of the handset, opened it, and removed the battery. The radio went dead. The gorge went quiet. The Alaskan night pressed in around her, absolutely vast and absolutely indifferent. The way wilderness always is, caring nothing about rank or order or the things that human beings convince themselves matter in the small warm rooms where they make their plans. She put the battery in her vest pocket. She picked up the radio and put it in the other pocket. She stood for a moment in the dark and the silence, and she thought about what she had just done. She had cut herself off, not just from the voice, from everyone, from any command that might legitimately be trying to reach her, from the rescue force, from the possibility of guidance or support or confirmation that she was doing the right thing. She was completely alone. In 11 years, she had never been alone by choice. The entire structure of the work she did was built on the opposite of aloneness, on the interdependence of a team, on the understanding that no single person's judgment was more reliable than the collective judgment of people who trusted each other enough to disagree openly. But the collective judgment was compromised. She didn't know by how much. She didn't know by whom. She knew by one person, at minimum whoever was on that radio with a valid military call sign and access to her tracking data, whoever was willing to burn 6 SEALs to cover something that apparently mattered more than their lives. Shepard, the name from the Northern Dawn radio channel. She thought about the voice on the emergency frequency. She thought about the comfort in it, the practiced ease, the authority that didn't need to be explained because it was assumed. She thought, I know that voice. She couldn't place it. Not yet. The concussion was eating the edges of her memory, making detailed recall unreliable. But the voice was not a stranger's voice. It lived somewhere in the organizational chart of the operation she had been part of. It belonged to someone who had been in the briefing rooms, someone who had access to the operational plan, someone who had smiled across a table and reviewed the same maps she had reviewed and shaken hands and given the kind of approval that made the people in the room feel like the work they were doing had meaning. She stood in the dark and she felt something she had been carefully not feeling for the past 3 hours. Because feeling it would have cost her too much. She felt it for exactly 10 seconds, and it was exactly as bad as she had known it would be. Then she filed it under variables she couldn't control, and she turned east toward Black Ridge Mine, and she walked. 40 minutes later, she saw the faint thermal glow of generators and human heat signatures through the rock, and she knew she had found the right mountain. She stopped at the outer perimeter and took stock of what she had. A damaged rifle with 3 confirmed reliable rounds. A compromised shoulder. A brain that was doing its best but filing regular complaints. A radio with no battery, 1 functioning NVG lens. And a broken piece of a beacon that told her someone inside that mountain was still alive. She lay down in the frozen dirt and put her eye to the thermal scope, and she began studying the guards, their patterns, the gaps in their coverage, the ways the mountain itself might work for her rather than against her. She had been trained for impossible situations. She had never particularly liked that about her work, the part where the word impossible came up so often and had to be treated as though it were simply a strong challenge rather than an accurate description of the odds. She lay in the dark and she studied the mountain and she made a plan. She was going in. The plan wasn't complicated. Complicated plans had a way of dying the moment they made contact with reality, and reality at Black Ridge Mine was already hostile enough without giving it extra angles to exploit. What Avery had was simpler than complicated and harder than easy, which was exactly where most of her best work had happened over 11 years. She studied the generator placement for 6 minutes. 6 minutes felt like a long time when the temperature was dropping, and her left shoulder was making increasingly specific complaints about the cold and the position she was holding. But 6 minutes was what the problem required, so 6 minutes was what she gave it. There were 2 generators, one primary, running the lights and equipment inside the mine, one secondary, positioned on the exterior's north face, running the guard post communications and the perimeter lighting that covered the eastern approach. The secondary was older. She could tell from the exhaust pattern, irregular, slightly labored, the kind of mechanical sound that told you the equipment had been pushed past its service window and kept running through stubbornness rather than proper maintenance. That was useful information. Old equipment under strain responds to interference in predictable ways. She also found the alarm. Cold War-era emergency beacon, bolted to the south face of the mine entrance structure. It had been painted over twice, which meant it had been here when Northern Dawn moved in and they hadn't bothered to remove it, which meant they either didn't know what it was or didn't think it would ever be used. Either way, it was connected to a separate circuit from the main generator, which meant it would still function even if the external power dropped. She circled wide around the perimeter, staying below the thermal coverage of the guard positions, using the rock formations for cover the way. Water uses the path of least resistance not because it chose to, but because the terrain made it the only rational direction. Her shoulder was a problem. Not an insurmountable one, but a real one. Every time she had to use her left arm to push off a surface or stabilize her body against the rock face, it sent a sharp, clarifying message straight through the fog. The concussion was laying over everything else. Pain, it turned out, was one of the few things that could cut through a concussion's interference. Not a helpful observation, but an accurate one. She reached the secondary generator at 4:17 in the morning. She had 43 minutes before the sky would begin its transition from black to the dark gray that preceded actual dawn. Once that transition started, her cover advantage degraded sharply. She worked quickly on the fuel line, not severing it. A severed line was immediately obvious, immediately traceable. Instead, she induced a slow restriction, the kind of restriction that would manifest as gradual power loss rather than sudden shutdown. The kind of thing that looked, at first, like equipment struggling, rather than equipment being sabotaged. Then she moved south, putting 300 yards between herself and the generator, and she activated the emergency alarm. The sound that came out of that old system was extraordinary. Even after decades of disuse, even after 2 coats of paint and Alaskan winters that would have destroyed less well-built equipment, the alarm had the full-throated authority of something designed to be heard across mountains. It went off like a statement rather than a warning, confident and immediate, echoing off the rock faces in multiple directions, so that pinpointing the origin took longer than the sound itself suggested. She counted the guard response. 4 of the 6 exterior guards moved toward the south face within 90 seconds. The 5th moved after the 6th, reluctantly, the way someone moves when they're following orders they personally disagree with. The 6th held his post for almost 40 seconds longer than the others before something on the radio he was carrying apparently convinced him to move. That left a gap, not a large gap, not a comfortable gap. Approximately 12 feet of unobserved approach to the mine entrance, across ground that offered almost no natural cover. With a time window she estimated at 3 minutes before someone realized the alarm was old equipment and not an actual emergency. Avery moved. She reached the mine entrance in 47 seconds, which was not particularly fast by any standard she held herself to, but was what her shoulder and her swimming vision and the frozen ground could produce. And she took it without complaint. She pressed herself against the interior wall just inside the entrance and held completely still and listened. Two voices somewhere deeper in the main tunnel. A third further back, talking intermittently in the clipped, disinterested tone of someone doing a job they had done many times before. Not excited. Not on alert. They had sent their people to investigate the alarm, and they were waiting for the all clear, which meant they were operating on the assumption that everything inside was secure. She moved through the entrance and into the dark. The mine was cold in a different way from the outside. Outside, the cold was wind-driven and exposed, the kind of cold that takes heat from you aggressively. Inside, the cold was settled and accumulated, the kind that has been sitting in one place long enough to become part of the architecture. The tunnels were narrow enough that her rifle was an immediate problem. Too long for the tight passages, especially with her shoulder the way it was. She couldn't bring it to a firing position quickly, a space this constricted. And a weapon you can't use fast enough is a weapon that becomes a liability before it becomes an asset. She slunk it across her back and worked with what her reach and her right hand could manage in close quarters. It wasn't a situation she preferred. She preferred 300 meters and a stable platform and all the time in the world. She had spent 11 years building that preference into a professional skill. The mine was not interested in her preferences. The maintenance lights were dim and widely spaced, which was both a problem and an advantage. She moved from one pool of light to the next the way she moved between covered positions in open terrain, committed, purposeful, not hesitating in the exposed spaces between, because hesitation in exposed spaces is where people die. She was 20 meters into the main tunnel when she heard a sound that made her stop completely. Not a voice, not footsteps. Something else. A rhythmic, deliberate sound, the kind of sound that something makes when it is being dragged across rock. 3 short. A pause. 3 short again. She knew that pattern. They had rehearsed it. Every member of Kestrel had rehearsed it in a training facility in Virginia that had been designed to simulate exactly this kind of confined space, no comms scenario. 3 short meant position known. A pause and 3 more meant need assistance. Someone was in one of the side chambers. She followed the sound. The door of the storage chamber had a lock on it, but the lock was not sophisticated. Northern Dawn had been operating in a mine, not a purpose-built detention facility. And improvised containment always has the weaknesses of improvisation. She worked the lock for 90 seconds before it surrendered, and then she pushed the door open and found them. 2 men, both alive, both in worse shape than she was, which she hadn't thought was possible 3 minutes earlier. Jonah Pike was the first one she recognized, medic. 36 years old, from Portland originally, though he'd stopped mentioning that years ago, after someone made a joke about it, that he hadn't appreciated. His left ankle was fractured. She could see the angle of his foot was wrong, in a way that a boot couldn't quite hide, and the swelling had forced the lacing open. He was sitting with his back against the chamber wall, his good leg extended, his fractured ankle supported on a flat piece of rock he had dragged into position. Even now, even with a fractured ankle in an improvised cell, inside a mountain in Alaska in the middle of the night, Jonah had found a way to manage his injury in the most medically rational way available to him. She found that specifically moving and couldn't quite say why. The second man was Mason Rourke, breacher. 29 years old, the youngest member of Kestrel, with blast injuries that had peppered the left side of his face with small fragments and left a cut across his forehead that had bled significantly and then dried without proper treatment. He was conscious and alert, which surprised her, given what his face looked like. And the first thing he did when he saw her was let out a breath so deep and controlled that it told her everything about how long he had been holding it in. Kane, Jonah said. His voice was low, careful, calibrated to carry no further than the room required. You look terrible. You're not in a position to comment, she said. She was already moving toward them, already running her right hand over Mason's injuries with the efficient assessment speed that emergency medicine and combat operations have in common. His pupils were equal, which was the most important thing. His breathing was clear. The blast fragmentation on his face had been numerous but shallow, painful, ugly, not life-threatening, provided nothing became infected over the next several days. His ribs concerned her more. He was breathing shallowly on the left side in a way that suggested they had taken impact. Can you move? She asked him. I've been moving since they put us in here, Mason said. Trying to find a way out. Did you? No. But I found structural weaknesses in 3 sections of wall that might be useful if you have anything left. She looked at his face battered, determined, already thinking about the next problem instead of the current pain. 29 years old. She had met people 3 times his age who didn't have that particular quality of forward focus. "I have one breaching charge and it's yours," she said. "But not yet." She turned to Jonah Holloway. Jonah's expression shifted. "Careful, as of 2 hours ago. Where?" "Deeper in. Main control room, we think." They moved him after he stopped. Took a breath. After they found the module. She went still. The data module. Mason picked up the thread, his voice dropping to something barely above a murmur. The commander hid it in his body armor after the blast. His rig was mostly intact, and he thought we all thought the armor would survive a search. They found it anyway. Someone knew to look there specifically. The implication sat between all 3 of them for a moment. "Shepard," Avery said. Jonah looked at her sharply. "What do you know about Shepard?" Name came up on their comms. "Northern Dawn contact. Someone who told them we were coming." She paused. "Someone who told them how we were coming and where." Mason was staring at her. "You know who it is?" "Not yet." She pulled the compact emergency radio from her vest and handed it to Jonah. "I need you to hold this but not use it until I transmit on the emergency guard frequency. When you hear that transmission, you key up and give your position. Rescue will be coming in from the south. The QRF knows the mine designation. Will come to you." Jonah took the radio with the careful precision of someone receiving something valuable. "And you?" "I'm going to get the commander." Mason pushed himself off the wall. "I'm coming." "You're staying," she said. "Kane Mason's." She said his name the way Holloway said names when the conversation was over. Clear, final. "Jonah can't walk, you can. That makes you his mobility and his security until the rescue element arrives. I need both of you alive and out of this mountain. I need you here to make that happen." He wanted to argue. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his hands had come up slightly, the physical language of someone who had been trained to solve problems by moving toward them. He was 29 years old, and he was a breacher, and his commander was somewhere deeper in the mountain, and every instinct he had was pointing in the same direction Avery was heading. But he stood down. Because she was right, and he knew she was right, and being 29 and a breacher and furious about the situation didn't change the math. "If you find him," Mason said, "tell him we held position." "He'll know," Jonah said quietly. "He already knows." She gave them everything she could spare. Medical supplies from her vest. The IR strobe she had been keeping as a last resort. 3 energy bars that she wasn't sure her stomach could have processed anyway given the concussion. She checked Jonah's ankle one more time, confirmed it was stabilized as well as available materials could manage, and then she moved toward the door. "Kane," Jonah said. She stopped. "He kept telling them he was alone," Jonah said. "The whole time they were working on him. They kept asking if there were survivors, and he kept saying he was the only one who made it. He knew they'd send a cleanup crew if he admitted there were others." She processed that for a moment. Holloway, injured and captive, in pain, deliberately protecting his team with the only resource he had left, which was the information inside his head that they wanted and the information outside his head that he could withhold, giving them nothing about the survivors, buying time and safety with nothing but words and silence and the willingness to absorb whatever pressure they applied. "Tell me about the control room," she said. "Tell me everything." They gave her 7 minutes of detailed information about the guard rotations they had observed, the layout of the tunnels between here and the control room, the number and approximate positions of Northern Dawn personnel inside the mine. 7 minutes of precise, disciplined observation from 2 people who had spent their captivity doing exactly what Avery had been taught to do with available time: learn the environment, map the variables, prepare for the moment when preparation becomes action. She left them with the door relocked. From the outside, locked was safer than open, because locked looked like nothing had changed, and she moved deeper into the mountain. The main tunnel ran approximately 240 meters before it opened into what the original mine schematics would have called the operations chamber. She didn't have the schematics. She was working from what Jonah and Mason had told her. From the thermal signatures she could partially read through her damaged optics, and from the increasingly detailed audio picture that the mountain's acoustics were providing. Tunnels carry sound in specific ways. You learn to read the information in it if you spend enough time listening. She stopped at the junction point between the main tunnel and the branch that led to the operations chamber. She heard voices, 2 voices close, a third intermittent somewhere further in. And underneath all of it, the specific electronic frequency of a satellite communication system warming up or cycling through a connection sequence. She had spent enough time in forward operating bases near satellite terminals to know that sound by its texture. She also heard something else, a voice she recognized. Not from the radio this time. In person. Carried through the mind's acoustics with enough fidelity that her brain made the identification before she had consciously assembled enough evidence to justify it. The voice was calm, controlled. It had the specific cadence of someone who had learned to present authority through tone, rather than volume, someone who had been in command positions long enough that raising his voice had become unnecessary, because the voice at normal volume was sufficient. She had been in briefing rooms with that voice. She had heard it review operational parameters and ask questions designed not to gather information, but to demonstrate that the asker already had it. Commander Warren Vale, intelligence liaison, attached to Operation North Star from the Joint Command Element. The man who had sat at the end of the briefing table 11 days ago and signed off on their route of approach. She pressed herself against the tunnel wall, and she listened. Vale was not in the mine. He was on the satellite terminal, his voice transmitting through a speaker system. He was talking to Creed. And what he was saying reorganized everything. Avery thought she understood about the previous 6 hours. The module unlock is your priority, Vale was saying. Once you have the data, the mine becomes a liability. Everything inside it becomes a liability. Do you understand what I'm telling you, Silas? Creed's response was measured, almost amused. I understand you. I have since the beginning. The rescue force is 3 hours out. We have a window, use it. And the seal a pause. Longer than the conversation warranted. Long enough to contain a decision. I told you. Everything inside the mine. Avery stood in the dark, and she felt the statement land the way physical impacts land, not with the theatrical drama of fictional violence, but with a dull, settling weight. Everything inside the mine. Holloway. The 2 SEALs she had just left with a radio and a fractured hope. Whatever Northern Dawn personnel Creed was willing to sacrifice to close off this particular problem. And her. Vale wasn't just a traitor. He wasn't just someone who had sold information for money or leverage or whatever had made him choose Northern Dawn over the people he was supposed to protect. He was proposing to collapse the mountain on top of everyone in it and write a report that explained the deaths as the result of unstable explosives and a mission gone wrong. A clean closure. The kind of closure that gets a memorial ceremony and a page in the official record and no further questions. She almost moved too soon. Almost. Her body was already sending instructions, step out and stop this conversation by the most direct means available. And she was already recognizing the instructions as the emotional response rather than the tactical one, and making herself wait. She needed more. She needed the conversation on record. She needed Vale's voice and Creed's voice and the specific content of what they were saying preserved in a form that could survive her. Because if she didn't survive the next 40 minutes, the information she was currently hearing needed to survive anyway. She reached into her vest for the field recorder. The unit was damaged. She had known it was damaged since the compound. The casing cracked on one side where rock had come down on it during the collapse. She powered it on. The indicator light came up weak and irregular, which told her the battery was compromised. She had partial recording capacity, maybe 5 minutes, maybe less. She pressed record and held the device toward the sound coming from the operations chamber. The satellite terminal was still active. Vale was giving Creed specific instructions about the demolition charges, where they were placed, which tunnels would be sealed first, the mechanical fail-safe sequence that would trigger if the primary electronic relay was disrupted. She caught all of it. Then the recorder's indicator light went dark. Battery gone. Recording stopped. She had no idea how much she had captured. She had no way to play it back and confirm. She had a damaged device that might have preserved 30 seconds of usable audio, or 3 minutes of usable audio, or nothing at all, and she couldn't know which until she was somewhere else. And she needed to be somewhere else immediately, because the conversation on the satellite terminal was ending, and when it ended, Creed would begin implementing the instructions Vale had just given him. She moved toward the operations chamber entrance. She had 3 rifle rounds. She had an injured shoulder. She had partial vision. She had a data recorder of uncertain reliability. She had the element of surprise, which was worth something enormous, and also worth nothing at all, depending on the next 20 seconds. She found her firing position in the ventilation passage above the chamber. The passage was narrow enough to be genuinely uncomfortable, and her shoulder made the prone position a negotiation between physical necessity and physical objection. She settled into it because the alternative was not settling into it, and she identified her 3 targets in order of priority. The satellite terminal, active and transmitting. The control panel in the northeast corner, the one that Jonah had described from his one-time glimpse through the chamber door during transport, the panel with the wiring cluster, that if Mason's assessment of mine electrical systems was accurate, connected to the demolition relay, and Creed himself, standing next to Holloway's chair, talking to the man strapped into it with the patient, unhurried manner of someone who has all the time in the world and knows it. He didn't. He had less time than he thought. So did Avery. That made them roughly equal in terms of urgency, which was not a comfortable place to audit from, but was the place available. Holloway was in the chair. His face was toward her, which meant if he saw movement in the ventilation passage, he would see it before Creed did. She needed him to see it and not react, not blink, not shift, not do anything that changed the picture in the room. She caught his eyes across the chamber. It took 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, his expression did something complicated and controlled. She saw recognition, not surprise, not relief exactly, something more precise than either. The look of a man who had believed someone was coming and was now processing the confirmation that he had been right. His face didn't change, no blink, no shift. His eyes moved back to Creed. She had her position. The technician at the secondary console announced that the module unlock would complete in approximately 60 seconds. Creed turned toward the terminal, and Avery took the gift of his divided attention. First shot, the satellite terminal. The impact was precise, and the terminal went offline with a violence that sent sparks and a shower of damaged casing across the chamber floor and produced exactly the chaos she needed. In the 4 seconds of confusion that followed, she was already adjusting to the control panel. Second shot, the demolition relay connection. She wasn't certain. She would not have bet her life on the certainty, but she was betting everything available on the best assessment she could make with one functional eye and 3 rounds and a damaged shoulder and a brain that was trying its genuine best. The control panel went dark. Creed had identified her position. He was moving toward Holloway, which was not a direction she could afford to let him continue. She fired the 3rd round to cut off his angle. Not at him, that would have required a clean shot through a space she didn't have, but into the equipment between him and Holloway. A shot that redirected his movement away from the chair and toward the side tunnel that connected to the mine's escape routes. He took it. She watched him make the calculation and take it, grabbing the data module from the technician's console in the same motion, and then he was gone into the side passage with 2 of his guards, and she was already dropping out of the ventilation passage into the chamber. The fall cost her. Her shoulder took the impact of the drop badly, and the gray came back at the edges of her vision hard enough that she had to put her hand against the chamber wall for 2 full seconds before she trusted herself to move forward. 2 seconds. In 2 seconds, Creed had covered 20 feet of tunnel. The guards in the chamber were recovering from the chaos of the impacts. The technician was on the floor behind his console. She crossed the chamber in 8 strides and reached Holloway. He looked up at her, and his first word was Creed. I know, he's gone. The module, I know. We'll handle it. She was already cutting the restraints. Her knife was in her right hand, and the work was awkward, and she was not gentle about the efficiency of it because there was no time for gentleness. Can you stand? Yes. He said it the way soldiers say things they're not entirely certain are true, but intend to make true through commitment. She cut the last restraint, and he stood in the way he stood told her the yes had been partially aspirational. He could stand. He could not run. His ribs, she could see it in the way he was breathing. The shallow, controlled compensation were damaged badly enough that full lung expansion was painful. And moving fast was going to require him to choose between speed and pain management in a way that had a clear answer but not a pleasant one. You came alone, he said. I had company most of the way, she said. It complicated things. Shepard, she looked at him. You know, I knew something was wrong with the operational intelligence before we hit the compound, he said. His voice was low and rough but functional. The placement of the charges matched our route too exactly. Someone gave them the briefing. Not a leak. A deliberate transfer. He paused. I suspected Vale. It is Vale, she said. Something moved through his expression that was too complicated to fully describe in the available time. She filed it for later. The charges, he said. The demolition relay. I hit the panel. I don't know how long it holds. It's not enough. He said it without drama as a piece of information. There's a mechanical backup. The relay interruption only stops the electronic trigger. The mechanical timer runs independently. It was built into the original mine demolition system from the Cold War installation. Vale told Creed about it specifically. She stared at him for a moment. How do you know what Vale told Creed? Because they told me, Holloway said, as a way of demonstrating that rescue was impossible. They wanted me to understand that even if someone came for me, the mountain would close before they could get us out. A pause. They didn't know you. The words landed differently than she expected them to. She didn't have time to examine why. How long, she asked. Mechanical timer from Vale's briefing to Creed. 12 minutes from the electronic relay interruption. He looked at the control panel she had destroyed. When did you watch? 4 minutes ago. Then we have 8 minutes, he said. And we're 240 meters from the side chambers where Jonah and Mason are. 8 minutes. 4 of it to reach the others. 4 minutes to find an exit route through a mine that was about to begin a controlled structural collapse. She did not allow herself to feel the specific quality of that particular number. She simply accepted it as the terrain and started moving. She had already taken 2 steps toward the main tunnel when Holloway said, Kane. She turned. The module has an emergency locator, he said. Creed doesn't know. Its passive doesn't transmit unless it receives an activation signal from my wrist unit. He raised his arm. The unit was still on his wrist, which meant his captors had missed it or hadn't understood what it was. If I activate it, every aircraft in range will know exactly where that module is. Creed becomes a beacon. She understood immediately. Do it. He activated it. The unit pulsed, once, twice, then settled into the silent, continuous transmission that meant the locator was live. Creed had just taken the module into the mountains with no idea he was broadcasting his position to every aircraft within 40 miles. She took Holloway's weight on her right side, not all of it, because he wasn't going to allow all of it, but enough that his left side could compensate for the ribs, and she moved them both toward the tunnel at the best speed the mountain and their bodies in 8 minutes would provide. Behind them, somewhere deeper in the mine, something shifted. A structural sound, deep and resonant. The kind of sound that large amounts of rock make when the stress distribution of their arrangement is beginning to change. Not a collapse. Not yet. A warning, the mountain clearing its throat. They had 8 minutes. They moved. The guards in the main tunnel were responding to the shots fired in the control room. She heard them before she saw them, heard the running steps and the radio chatter and the specific urgency of people who have been in a bad situation and are now responding to a worse one. She pulled Holloway into a side recess in the tunnel wall, an equipment alcove, old and unused, and they pressed flat against the back of it and held completely still as 2 Northern Dawn personnel ran past them in the direction of the operations chamber. She counted 3 seconds after the footsteps faded, and then she pulled Holloway back into the main tunnel. I know a faster route, he said. She looked at him. You've never been in this mine. I've been in this mine for 4 hours, he said. I paid attention. She let him lead, and he led well, not fast, because fast wasn't available to either of them, but efficiently, choosing angles through the tunnel system that avoided the bottlenecks and the guard positions and moved them toward the storage chamber in the shortest available route. She had worried he'd overestimate his own functionality, the way injured people sometimes do in high adrenaline situations, and find himself wrong at a critical moment. He didn't. He was precise about what he could do and what he couldn't, and he communicated the difference in real time without drama or complaint. She had never respected anyone more than she respected him at that particular moment, and she's respected him quite a lot before the night started. They reached the storage chamber with 6 minutes remaining on her estimate. She unlocked the door. Mason was on his feet in the doorway before she had it fully open. Jonah was behind him, standing on one leg with his weight against the wall, his face hard with concentration and something that looked like it wanted to be relief but was waiting for more information before committing. How bad? Mason asked, looking at Holloway. Manageable? Holloway said. His ribs are compromised, Avery said. He needs support on the left side. Mason, that's your job. Mason moved to Holloway's left without argument. She took Jonah's right side, his arm over her shoulders, her right arm around his waist, her left arm providing what it could between shoulder complaints. The ore shaft, Holloway said, 200 meters northeast. There's a vertical lift passage that reaches the surface. Collapsed, she asked, partially, but not completely. She looked at Mason. You said you had 1 breaching charge. Still have it. Then not completely is enough. The mountain shifted again. Deeper this time. More sustained. Whatever stress the demolition charges were imposing on the structural integrity of Black Ridge Mine's lower sections was beginning to propagate upward, and the propagation had a sound to it that she didn't want to listen to too carefully, because the sound contained information she didn't find useful. Move. she said. They moved. The four of them, bound together by injury and necessity, and the specific trust that only exists between people who have decided to live or die on the basis of whether they can work together, began their journey through the mountain toward the surface and whatever was waiting above it. The mountain was 5 minutes from deciding whether to let them pass. They had everything and they had almost nothing, and they moved through the dark together, and the rock above them groaned with the weight of everything that was coming. 5 minutes. That was what the mechanical timer gave them, and the mountain had already started its accounting. Avery felt the first real structural shift through the soles of her boots, not sound, not vibration exactly, but a change in the way the floor transmitted pressure, as though the rock beneath them had made a quiet internal decision and was beginning to act on it. She had Jonah's weight on her right side. Mason had Holloway's left. The four of them moved through the tunnel in a formation that looked nothing like any military movement she had ever trained for, and everything like the only thing that was going to work in the available space and time. Jonah was trying not to put weight on his fractured ankle and mostly succeeding, which meant he was loading all of it onto his right leg and onto Avery's shoulder, and her shoulder was submitting a formal grievance about the arrangement with every step. She ignored it. The shoulder would have to wait. Northeast, Holloway said. His voice was controlled, but she could hear the compression in it, the shallow quality that told her his ribs were making breathing expensive. He was rationing his air, precisely the way you ration ammunition when you don't know how long the fight has left. There's a junction at the end of this passage. Right fork goes deeper. Left fork goes to the ore shaft. How far is the shaft from the surface? Mason asked. 70, 80 meters vertical. The lift platform is still in place, but the cable is gone. There's a maintenance ladder on the east wall of the shaft. Mason processed this. Jonah can't climb a ladder with that ankle. No, Avery said. Silence for 3 steps. Then Mason said, I can rig a harness from the climbing rope. Canvas from the supply cache. It won't be fast. It doesn't need to be fast, Avery said. It needs to work. It'll work, Mason said. There was no qualification in it, no maybe or probably. Just the flat certainty of someone whose entire professional identity was built on making structural problems submit to his particular expertise. She believed him. The junction appeared ahead of them in the thin maintenance lighting, and Holloway said left, and she took them left. And 23 meters further along the left fork, the tunnel opened into the ore shaft chamber. Avery heard the structural shift before she saw its effect. A deep, tectonic complaint from somewhere below them, the lower sections of the mine, where the demolition charges had been designed to create maximum structural disruption. The sound came up through the rock and through the floor, and through the walls simultaneously, the way sound moves through solid material, omnidirectional and intimate. Dust fell from the ceiling of the chamber in a thin, continuous rain. 3 minutes, Holloway estimated. He was looking at the shaft wall, at the maintenance ladder that ran up the east face. Old iron bolted into stone at regular intervals, extending upward into the dark where the emergency lighting didn't reach. Mason was already moving. He set Holloway against the chamber wall, gently but efficiently, the practice motion of someone who understood that wounded people needed to be placed, not guided, and he pulled the climbing rope from Avery's pack, which she had angled toward him without being asked because they were operating at the level of communication that didn't require words anymore. Jonah, Mason said, I'm going to need you to trust me completely and not shift your weight during the ascent. Jonah looked at the harness taking shape in Mason's hands. That looks like something you built in 30 seconds. 25, Mason said. Stop counting and get into it. Jonah complied. He lowered himself to the floor and let Mason work the harness around him with the fast, sure movements of a man who had rigged breaching equipment in the dark under fire and found canvas harness construction comparatively relaxing. You're going up first, Avery told Jonah. I can wait. You're going up first because you're the one we can't carry on the ladder, and because Mason needs to be free to go up independently so he can manage the rope from the top. You go first, that's the sequence. Jonah looked at her for one long moment with the expression of someone who has been the medical authority in enough bad situations to know exactly how bad the current one is, and who is currently making peace with not being the one making the calls. Understood, he said. She turned to Holloway. Can you manage the ladder? He looked at it. She watched him make an honest assessment rather than an optimistic one, which told her his judgment was still functioning despite everything the night had thrown at it. With support on the left side and slower than I'd like, he said. Yes, I'll be behind you, she said. You set the pace. The mountain shifted again. This time, the shift had a different quality, not the slow structural complaint of the lower sections, redistributing stress, but a sharper, closer sound. Something in the tunnel they had just come through. Something changing in the direction they had come from. Not just charges. Movement. Avery turned. Through the chamber entrance, down the left fork tunnel, she could hear footsteps. Multiple sets. Moving fast and not bothering to be quiet about it, which meant they knew exactly where their targets were, or were close enough to confident that precision no longer seemed necessary. Mason, she said, how fast can you get Jonah to the top? Mason looked up the shaft, looked at Jonah. Did the math the way breachers do math, fast, applied, committed to the answer once it arrives. 6 minutes. Maybe 5 if he helps. I can help, Jonah said immediately. You have a fractured ankle. I have 2 hands and 1 good leg and a powerful interest in surviving this, Jonah said. I can help. The footsteps in the tunnel were getting louder. 2 minutes. Maybe less before they reached the chamber entrance. She looked at Holloway. He was already looking at her. Go with them, he said. That's not the sequence. Kane, I said, that's not the sequence. She unslung her rifle. 3 rounds gone. Nothing left but the physical weight and reach of the weapon itself. She turned it in her hands and gripped it by the barrel. And Holloway watched her do it and understood what she was doing and what she was going to do with it, and said nothing because there was nothing that needed to be said. Get to the ladder, she told him. Start when Mason starts. Don't wait for me. I am not leaving you at the bottom of a mine shaft. You're not leaving me, she said. You're going first because you're slower. And I need you moving while I buy us a window. That's not abandonment, that's math. He stared at her. She held the stare, not with aggression, but with the specific calm that she had built over 11 years into something that could survive situations designed to destroy it. When I tell you to move, she said quietly, you move. That's an order, Commander, from your overwatch. Something shifted in his expression. The ghost of something that might have been a difficult smile on a different night, in a different context. You're serious, he said. I am completely serious. You're outranked. Respectfully, sir, she said. You're standing in a collapsing mine with 2 cracked ribs and no ammunition. My rank is functional. Yours is currently theoretical. He moved toward the ladder. Mason had Jonah's harness connected to the rope and was beginning the ascent alongside him. 1 hand on the rope, 1 hand on the ladder. Moving with the focused efficiency of someone who has decided speed and caution are not opposites but complements. Jonah moved beside him, his right hand gripping the ladder rungs, his good leg pushing, his fractured ankle held clear of the wall. He made no sound about it. She had expected him to make no sound about it. It was consistent with everything she knew about Jonah Pike. Holloway reached the ladder and began climbing. She watched him find his pace, steady, deliberate, each movement planned before it was executed. His left arm doing less than his right, but doing what it could. Good, she could work with that speed. She turned to face the chamber entrance. The footsteps in the tunnel stopped. That was more alarming than the footsteps themselves, because moving adversaries are predictable, and stopped adversaries are not. She pressed against the chamber wall beside the entrance, the rifle held at the balance point, and she waited. A voice came from down the tunnel. Not shouting, not threatening, speaking at a normal volume with the deliberateness of someone who wanted to be clearly heard and had decided that demonstrating calm was a tactical asset. There's nowhere to go, the voice said. The lower sections are already gone. The shaft you're trying to use has a collapsed section 60 meters up. You won't make it, she said nothing. The woman, the voice continued. I know you're the sniper. I know you're injured. I know you've been moving with a concussion since the compound. You've done something remarkable tonight, and I genuinely mean that. But remarkable doesn't change physics. The shaft collapses in approximately 90 seconds. Come out now and we can discuss options. She evaluated the voice. Measured. Professional. Someone who had been trained in negotiation techniques or had developed their own version of them through practice. The specific appeal to her accomplishment, you've done something remarkable, was designed to create a connection, a sense of being seen and acknowledged, a psychological opening through which compliance might follow. She had been trained to recognize that technique. She had also been trained in what came after it when it didn't work. She looked up the shaft. Mason and Jonah were 30 meters up, moving steadily. Holloway was 20 meters. She had 60 seconds, maybe 70. The voice from the tunnel spoke again. Last chance. She calculated the distance and the angle and the tight corridor geometry, and she did what the situation required, which was not what she preferred and not what she was trained for, and not anything that felt controlled or precise. She created noise and confusion and a reason for the people in that tunnel to put their attention on the floor rather than on the shaft. And she used the 4 seconds that bought her to reach the ladder and start climbing. Her shoulder's formal grievance upgraded to an emergency petition. She climbed anyway. The first 10 rungs were the hardest. Her left arm was doing approximately 40% of what it was being asked to do, which meant her right arm was compensating for 60% of its own load, plus 40% of the other side's, which was a structural arrangement that no physical training had specifically prepared her for. Her vision was doubling in a way that made the ladder a dual image, 2 ladders, slightly offset, the real one and the ghost of it, and she had to make a specific cognitive decision at every rung about which image was accurate. She picked the one that felt solid, and she climbed. Below her, someone entered the chamber. She heard the sound of their entry, and the sound of them identifying the shaft, and beginning to process what was happening. And she climbed faster in the way that people climb faster, when they understand that the rate of someone else's comprehension is directly related to their own survival timeline. A shot came up the shaft. High and wide, she heard it hit stone 8 feet to her left, which told her the shooter didn't have a clean angle and was firing on estimate rather than aim. She pressed herself against the ladder and kept moving. 30 meters. She was 30 meters up. The maintenance lighting below gave her a reference point. She was level with the upper limit of the installed lighting, which meant above her was dark. She climbed into the dark, and the dark swallowed her completely. No visual reference now. Only the ladder beneath her hands and feet, the sounds from below, more voices, more movement, and the sounds from above, which were Mason and Jonah, and the occasional quiet grunt from Holloway that told her he was still moving. Then Holloway's voice came down. Clear, directed, calibrated to reach her specifically. Collapse section. 20 meters above me, Mason is assessing. She climbed toward his voice. She heard Mason before she saw him, or felt him the vibration of his movement through the ladder rungs, transmitted downward in the specific way that physical structures carry information. Then her head came level with the ledge where the shaft narrowed, where a section of the shaft wall had come in decades ago and been left in place because the ore extraction didn't require this particular section. To be clear, Mason was pressed against the narrowing, his hands already on the collapsed section, running over the surface of it with the concentrated attention of someone reading a language that most people don't know exists. How bad, she asked. 3 feet of loose material plus a fixed section, he said. Fixed section has a crack running diagonally. The crack is load-bearing in the wrong direction. Can you open it? He looked at her. In the dark, she couldn't see his expression clearly, but she didn't need to. She could hear what his expression would have been in the quality of his silence. I have 1 charge left, he said. I know. If I use it here, the blast in this confined space, I know what it will do, she said. How much cover do we have? He looked around the shaft. Above the collapsed section, Jonah was already positioned on a natural ledge. She could hear him up there, his breathing, his movement as he pressed himself into the corner. Below the collapsed section was a recessed alcove in the shaft wall, old equipment housing, long empty. That alcove, Mason said. If we're in that alcove when it blows, how competent. Not because he wasn't sure, because he was being honest about the margin. 75%, he said. 75%. She processed that. The alternative to 75% was the shaft as it currently stood, which gave them 0% against the mine timeline and approximately 30 seconds before the people below them located their position in the dark. Holloway, she said. Already moving to the alcove, Holloway said from below her. She looked at Mason, said it. Mason set the charge. He worked with the speed of someone for whom this particular motion had been performed so many times that it had left the category of skill and entered the category of reflex. 10 seconds, 12 seconds. He looked at her and gave her a nod. Alcove, she said now. They moved down the ladder fast, Avery going first, Mason right behind her, and they pressed into the alcove beside Holloway in a configuration that was not comfortable for any of them, and was especially detailed in its discomfort for Holloway's ribs and Avery's shoulder. But comfort was a very distant consideration. Jonah, Mason called up. Brace from above, ready. Mason triggered the charge. In a confined stone shaft, an explosive charge of that type at that distance does things to the air and the surface of the skin and the inner ear that no description fully captures. The closest approximation is that every molecule in the available space tries to occupy a different space simultaneously, and the architecture makes that impossible, and the result is a pressure event that the human body Experiences as total and immediate and extraordinarily loud. Then it was over. Dust, the specific dry smell of blasted stone, ringing in both ears that rated approximately 8 out of 10 on the scale of things she would rather not experience again. And above them, through the settling dust, a gap. Light. Not daylight, the gray of pre-dawn was not yet full enough for that, but lighter than the shaft had been. The sky's earliest acknowledgement that the night was ending. The collapsed section was open. "Move," she said, and her own voice sounded like it was coming from the other side of something thick. The blast had done something specific and temporary to her hearing, which was a variable she cataloged and accepted and set aside because the shaft was open and the mine was still counting down, and the people below them were not going to remain confused for much longer. They climbed. Mason went first because Mason was the fastest and the most physically intact, and she needed him at the top to pull Jonah clear and establish whatever situation was waiting above them. Then Jonah, his jaw set against the pain of the ascent, his hands working the ladder with a focus that she found specifically admirable. Then Holloway, steady and deliberate, and not fast but reliable, in the way that experienced people are reliable, not with youth's energy but with discipline's endurance. She came last, 70 meters of vertical ladder, the top 20, through a gap that still rained dust and required her to turn sideways to fit her gear through. She pushed through it, and her hands hit surface rock and then the surface itself, and she pulled herself up and over the rim of the shaft. Gray pre-dawn light. Cold air that felt like an entirely different atmosphere from what she had been breathing for the past 3 hours. The eastern sky had the first suggestion of color, not color exactly, but the absence of the absolute dark that had been there before. A graduation, a signal. She had made it out. She lay on the surface rock for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds was what she permitted herself. Then she pushed to her feet and took inventory. Mason was standing, physically intact, already scanning the terrain. Jonah was on the ground, his back against the shaft rim, his fractured ankle extended, breathing hard but breathing well. Holloway was on one knee, his hand on the ground for balance, his ribs making his breathing audible in a way that told her they needed medical attention within the next several hours and could survive without it until then. She looked east. The concealed airstrip that Holloway had marked in his ice message was visible from their elevated position. She could see the flat, cleared area below the ridge and the small cargo aircraft still sitting on it, and the figure moving toward it with the purposeful speed of someone who has made a decision and is executing it. Creed, with the module. The locator beacon active and transmitting, but Creed, not knowing that, moving toward his escape route with the confidence of someone who believes the mountain is handling his problems behind him. She assessed her options. Her rifle had no rounds. She was at an elevation that should have been perfect for a sniper and was instead perfectly useless because she had nothing to fire. Her legs could not cover the distance to the airstrip before the aircraft departed. She had no communications that could reach the incoming rescue force. Then Holloway said Avery. She turned. He was still on one knee, but he had his hand extended toward her, and in his hand was a magazine. Compact, partially loaded. She could tell from the weight at a glance, but functional. She stared at it. "You had that the whole time." "I had it the whole time," he confirmed. "I hid it in the lining of my boot. They searched my vest, my rig, my pockets. Not my boots." She took the magazine, checked it. 4 rounds. 4 was not 3. 4 was something entirely different from 3. "Kane," Holloway said. He was watching her face, watching the calculations she was running behind her eyes. "What are you thinking?" She looked at the aircraft. Then at the landing gear, the front strut, the single point that, if compromised, would prevent the aircraft from safely accelerating to takeoff speed on an unprepared strip. "I'm not thinking about Creed," she said. "I'm thinking about the aircraft." She loaded the magazine, rolled into a prone position on the rim of the shaft, settled the rifle against her right shoulder. Her left was not available for this, and she made the adjustment without drama, and she found the landing gear in her scope. The range was significant. The light was poor. Her vision was still impaired. Her heart rate, she was aware, was elevated in a way that would affect precision, and her breath control was compromised by the physical state of the last 3 hours. She had 11 years of training for exactly this. She breathed. Out, not all the way. To the natural respiratory pause, the half-breath space where the body is briefly still, where a trained shooter exists in the gap between one heartbeat and the next. She fired. The front landing gear of the cargo aircraft collapsed. Not catastrophically, it wasn't that kind of impact, but definitively. The strut buckled, and the nose of the aircraft dropped, and the aircraft was not going anywhere under its own power from that point forward. From the direction of the airstrip, she heard shouting. She watched through her scope as Creed reached the aircraft and stopped. Saw him assess the landing gear and understand what had happened and what it meant. Watched him look up at the ridge from which the shot had come, though she was too far and too low for him to see her directly. He looked at the mountains. He looked at the aircraft. He looked at the module in his hand. Then his radio crackled. She couldn't hear the transmission from this distance, but she could see its effect on him. He grabbed the radio. He spoke into it. He listened. And whatever he heard made him look east toward the incoming sound that she could now hear herself. The rotors of approaching aircraft, multiple aircraft, coming from the south the way she had told the KRF to come, and moving with the speed and directional commitment of a rescue force that had finally been given accurate coordinates. The beacon had done its work. The module in Creed's hand had been broadcasting his position to every aircraft in range since the moment Holloway triggered his wrist unit. The rescue force hadn't been navigating to the mine. They had been navigating to the module. They had been navigating to Creed. He ran. Avery watched him run, up the ridge, away from the airstrip, the module still in his hand, still broadcasting, and she let him run because running was all he had left, and the aircraft above him would find him before he found anywhere to go. Her radio. She needed her radio. She reached into her vest, found the handset, pulled the battery from her other pocket, seated it, powered the unit on. Signal, clean and strong and real. She keyed the guard frequency and she spoke. She did not request rescue. She did not give her position or ask for status or follow any of the standard emergency communication protocols she had memorized in training. Instead, she pressed the transmit button and she played the field recorder's output directly into the radio frequency, broadcasting whatever the damaged device had managed to capture from the satellite terminal in the mine's operations chamber. Vale's voice. Creed's voice. The specific conversation about what the mine contained and what was to be done with its contents. 8 seconds of it, maybe 12, maybe more. She still didn't know how much the recorder had captured, but she knew the quality of what it had captured because she could hear it now through the radio speaker, tinny and compressed and absolutely unmistakable. Everything inside the mine. Creed's voice confirming, Vale's voice authorizing. She broadcast it twice. Then she keyed up again and gave her position, her status, the number of survivors, and the name Warren Vale. The rescue frequency exploded. Not with chaos, with the controlled, multiplying activity of a command network that has just received information that reorganizes its entire operational picture. Stations demanding authentication. Aircraft requesting confirmation. A second voice, senior, authoritative, demanding to know the source of the transmission. She gave her name. She gave her identifier. She gave Holloway's name and identifier. And then a voice she didn't expect, a voice from one of the inbound aircraft. The pilot, steady and professional, said, "Overwatch element, this is Rescue 1. We have your position. We have a second signal east of your location. Can you confirm hostile?" The B Creed, confirmed hostile, she said. The signal is carrying a stolen military data module. Do not let it leave the area. Copy, the pilot said. We see him. From the east ridge, she heard a second aircraft break off from the incoming formation, angling toward the position the beacon was transmitting. Then she heard Vale's voice come onto the network. Clean. Controlled. The same practiced authority she had heard on the emergency frequency in the gorge. This is Commander Vale. That recording is fabricated. The operative transmitting has a severe concussion and is not competent. I am ordering all aircraft to hold their current positions until I can authenticate. The pilot cut across him, flat and immediate. Sir, I have 4 personnel at the mineshaft exit, displaying American identification panels and calling for medical. I am not holding my position. That is a direct order. Sir, the pilot said, and his voice had something in it that Avery recognized across the frequency. Something that had nothing to do with rank, and everything to do with a person making a decision about what they were and were not willing to do. I am proceeding to the rescue. Vale's authority began to collapse in real time across the network. The way authority built on false ground always collapses eventually, not slowly, but all at once, each piece taking the next with it. Avery lowered the radio. She was breathing hard. She had not been aware of how hard she had been breathing until the moment the transmission ended, and she stopped performing function and allowed herself to exist for a moment as a person rather than an operator. Mason was beside her. He had his hand on her right arm, and she wasn't sure when that had happened. You okay? He asked. She considered the question with the honest assessment she tried to apply to all things. No, she said. He nodded once. That was enough. Holloway had made it to his feet. He was standing, actually standing, both legs, his hand against Mason's shoulder for balance, but his weight on himself. He was looking east at the ridge, where the second aircraft was converging on Creed's position. His expression was something she had to look away from because it contained things that were too large for the moment, and she didn't have the capacity to receive them. He had the demolition codes in the satellite terminal, Holloway said. Veil. He built the fail-safe into the original plan so that if the mission was compromised, if anyone survived, he could close it. I know, she said. How long have you known it was him? She thought about the voice on the emergency frequency. The voice that had known her name and her injuries and her direction. The voice that had known too much. Since the gorge, she said. I didn't have a name until the control room. He was quiet for a moment. I've known Warren Vale for 14 years. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Some information needs to be received without response. Some facts are too heavy for the moment they arrive in and have to be set down and returned to later. Below the ridge, the mine made its final statement. The sound wasn't what she expected. No dramatic single explosion, no Hollywood column of fire, just a sustained deep, grinding compression, the sound of many thousands of tons of rock deciding simultaneously to occupy the same space. And then a massive eruption of dust from the mine entrance and the shaft opening and every crack in the surface rock. A gray-white cloud that rolled across the airstrip and up the ridge face and over them in a wave. She closed her eyes. She had been inside that mountain 19 minutes ago. The dust settled on her hair, on the back of her hands, on the rifle she was still holding. She felt it against her face like the finest imaginable grit, like the mountain breathing its last breath against her skin. She opened her eyes. The aircraft was descending through the dust cloud toward their position. She could see the medical personnel in the doorway before it landed, already moving, already doing what they had come to do. Jonah first, she said. His ankle needs imaging. Then the commander's ribs, Kane. Holloway said. I'm fine. You have a severe concussion, a partially dislocated shoulder, early hypothermia, and you've been operating for... He checked the sky, estimating approximately 4.5 hours in sub-zero conditions with compromised equipment. I know what I have, she said. Then you know you're not fine. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The specific quality of that exchange, two people who have survived something together and are now trying to find the language for what comes after, was not something she had vocabulary for. We're all here, she said. That's what fine means right now. He looked at Jonah, at Mason, at the aircraft settling toward them through the clearing dust. He looked back at her. Yes, I suppose it does. The medics hit the ground at a run, and everything after that happened with the organized urgency of people who were very good at the specific work of pulling people back from the edge of what the human body could survive. They went for Jonah immediately, the way Avery had directed, and then two of them moved toward Holloway, and she stepped back to give them the space. She stood at the edge of the group. The eastern sky was lightening, not with color yet, but with the graduated gray that meant color was coming. The mountains were beginning to emerge from the dark in their actual dimensions rather than the shapes her damaged vision had been constructing through the night. They were enormous. They had always been enormous. The night had made them feel infinite because she couldn't see their limits. Now in the approaching dawn, she could see where they ended and where the sky began, and both things were beautiful in a way she didn't have words for and wasn't sure she needed. Behind her, the mountain that had been Black Ridge Mine continued to settle, patient and indifferent and vast as mountains always are. She was still standing when the second aircraft returned from the East Ridge with Creed in custody and the module confirmed recovered. She heard the confirmation over her radio and she pressed her eyes closed for 3 seconds and let the weight of the night shift slightly. Not lift, not resolve, but move, the way weight moves when you share it. A medic appeared at her shoulder, young, serious-faced. Ma'am, we need you, she said. Jonah first. Then the commander already. Then me, she said, in order. The medic looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has encountered this particular category of person before and has developed a protocol for it. Yes, ma'am, he said, and waited. She looked at the mountains one more time. At the sky where the color was finally beginning to arrive, the first honest light of dawn, breaking across the peaks, turning the gray to something warmer, something that had the quality of continuation rather than conclusion. She had gone into that darkness alone. She had come back with 3 people she was not willing to leave. She thought about Daniels, the way she always thought about Daniels at the moments when decisions resolved themselves into outcomes. She thought about the 2 years she had spent carrying his memory as a weight rather than a lesson. She thought about what Holloway had said to her in the field mess on a deployment she had wanted to forget, and how she had never been able to forget it because it was true. Discipline includes independent judgment. She had learned that tonight in a way that no briefing room would ever teach. She turned to the medic. "Okay," she said, "let's go." He moved and she followed, and the dawn came up over Black Ridge and covered everything in the particular light that comes after the longest nights. Not forgiving, not forgetting, but continuing, which is the most honest thing the morning has to offer. They were out. They were all out. And the mountain, patient and enormous and indifferent, kept its secrets from that point forward. The medical helicopter lifted off at 5:23 in the morning. Avery knew the time because she had looked at her watch the moment the skids left the ground, and she didn't fully understand why she had done that until later, until she was lying in a hospital bed in Anchorage with an IV in her right arm and a neurology consult scheduled for the following morning and all the time in the world to examine the small automatic things she had done in the hours before. She had looked at her watch because she needed to mark it. Needed the time to be real and recorded, not just felt. 5:23 a.m., Alaska Standard Time. That was when the 4 of them left the mountain together. The flight was 37 minutes. She knew that time too because she tracked it, sitting against the interior wall of the helicopter with a thermal blanket around her shoulders and a medic's pen light doing things to her pupils that her concussed brain objected to with significant specificity. "Follow the light," the medic said. "I am following the light. Your left eye is lagging." "I know." "That's consistent with a grade 3 concussion, ma'am." "Possibly grade." "I know what it's consistent with," she said. Not unkindly, she simply knew, and restating, it wasn't making either of them more comfortable. "How's Jonah?" The medic glanced across the helicopter interior to where Jonah was strapped to a litter, his ankle immobilized in an inflatable splint. His eyes closed but his breathing regular and deep. "Stable, fracture is clean. Surgical reduction, probably. He'll walk again. 2 fractured ribs, 1 cracked. Possible internal bruising to the left lung. The medic paused. "He's arguing with the other medic about whether he needs oxygen." Avery closed her eyes. "He needs the oxygen. That's what we're telling him." "Tell him it's an order from his Overwatch element," she said. "He'll understand the reference." She heard, from across the helicopter, Holloway's voice saying something she couldn't make out, and then a brief silence, and then the specific sound of someone accepting a piece of medical equipment with the dignity of a man who would prefer not to need it, but has decided that needing it is the more rational choice. She permitted herself the smallest possible version of a smile, and then let it go because her face hurt and smiling was an expense she wasn't sure the current budget supported. Mason was seated across from her, his blast injuries cleaned and dressed. His fractured, she had been right about his ribs, 2 of them bound with compression wrap. He was awake and alert in the way that people are awake and alert when their body is running on the final reserves of adrenaline before the crash. That specific glassy clarity that feels like function, but is actually the last light in a room where the power is almost gone. He was watching her. "What?" "Nothing," he said. He stopped. He looked at his hands. He looked back at her. "I've been on 6 deployments," he said. "I've worked with a lot of people in a lot of bad situations." She waited. "I've never seen anything like what you did tonight," he said. She looked at him steadily. "You built a harness in 25 seconds in a collapsing mine shaft," she said. "I've never seen anything like that either." He was quiet for a moment. "Then Jonah said something while we were waiting in that chamber, before you came." "What did he say?" "He said he thought there was maybe a 30% chance anyone was coming for us." Mason looked at the floor of the helicopter. "He said 30% was enough to keep working with." She absorbed that. Thought about Jonah Pike in that cold chamber with a fractured ankle, doing the math on survival probability with the same clinical precision he brought to medical triage, and deciding that 30% was a number worth respecting. "He was right," she said. "Yeah," Mason said. "He was." The helicopter banked slightly as it began its descent toward Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, and through the small porthole window, she caught the first full light of dawn spreading across the Alaska range. The mountains were lit from the east now, the peaks catching gold before the valleys below them did, the way sunrise always works in high terrain from the top down, light descending rather than rising, which always struck her as the opposite of what intuition suggested. She watched the light on the mountains until the helicopter's angle took it away from her. At Elmendorf, the medical team was waiting on the tarmac. Not just medical, she counted 3 people in civilian clothes, standing 30 feet back from the landing zone, the specific body language of federal law enforcement, the way they held themselves slightly apart from the uniformed personnel, and slightly too still for people who were simply waiting. She noticed them the way she noticed everything she had been trained to notice, automatically and without particular significance, and filed the observation away. Jonah went off the helicopter first on a gurney, attended by 2 nurses and a trauma surgeon who had clearly been briefed on the ankle and was already talking about imaging before Jonah was fully clear of the aircraft. Holloway came next, walking on his own and holding the oxygen mask in his hand rather than over his face until a uniformed doctor at the bottom of the ramp gave him a look that communicated professional opinions clearly enough that Holloway put the mask back on without being told verbally. Mason helped Avery down the ramp. She didn't need the help and they both knew it, but he offered it and she accepted it because some gestures are not about need, and they both knew that too. At the bottom of the ramp, one of the 3 civilian figures moved toward her. A woman, mid-40s, the kind of face that had learned to reveal exactly as much as it intended to reveal and nothing else. She held a federal identification case open with the practiced economy of someone who had made that gesture several thousand times. "Chief Petty Officer Kane," she said. "I'm Special Agent Diana Marsh, FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force. I need to speak with you." "I need to speak with a doctor first," Avery said. "Weak Agent Marsh," she said, and her voice had the specific quality that 11 years of training and 1 very long night had built into it. "I have a grade 3 concussion, a partially dislocated shoulder, and my core temperature is currently interesting enough that the medic on the helicopter made a specific note about it. I am going to speak with a doctor. After that, I will speak with you for as long as you need. That is not negotiation. That's the sequence." Marsh looked at her for a moment. Then something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly, but acknowledged. "We'll be in the building," she said. "Take your time." It took 4 hours. She didn't take more time than she needed, but she took every hour the medical staff required, and what they required was thorough. Grade 3 concussion confirmed. Shoulder partially dislocated, now reduced and immobilized, which was a process she was glad she had been only partially conscious for. 2 cracked ribs she hadn't known about the shoulder pain, had been loud enough to drown them out during the night, but in the quiet of the examination room they made themselves known with the confident permanence of things that had been there the whole time. Mild hypothermia as expected. A cut along her jaw that needed 4 stitches and that she had indeed been unable to locate during the initial post-blast inventory. The doctor who delivered the summary was a naval flight surgeon named Reyes, who had the calm, sequential delivery style of someone who had given similar summaries to similar people many times and had learned to present it as information rather than verdict. "Full recovery expected across the board," he said. "The shoulder needs 6 to 8 weeks. The ribs are going to be your most annoying problem because there's nothing to do but wait. The concussion," he paused. "I want you in neurology tomorrow morning. The eye tracking is something I want a specialist's opinion on before I make any clearance recommendations." "Understood," she said. "You should be telling me this is going to affect your timeline to return to duty," he said. "Most people in your position have that conversation immediately." She thought about it. "I'm not most people," she said, "and I'm not having that conversation today." Reyes looked at her over his clipboard. "Fair enough," he said. Agent Marsh was waiting in a conference room on the base's administrative level. She was alone now, the other federal agents apparently deployed elsewhere, and she had a recorder on the table and a legal pad, and a cup of coffee she offered Avery before anything else. Avery took it. It was the first hot thing she had consumed since before the insertion. She gave the debrief with the same precision she brought to everything. Chronological, detailed, honest about uncertainty. She said when she didn't know something and didn't speculate past the evidence. She explained the decisions she had made at each inflection point, holding position, choosing to follow the trail, removing the radio battery, entering the mine, electing to get the survivors out rather than pursue Creed without apologizing for any of them and without overstating the certainty with which they had been made. Marsh listened without interrupting for 41 minutes. Then she said, "The recording from your field device." "Damaged," Avery said. "I don't know the exact capture duration. I heard it broadcast. It was recognizable. Whether it's forensically usable depends on your audio analysis team." "It's usable," Marsh said. Avery went still. "You've had it analyzed already." The transmission went across the common guard frequency at 57 a.m. We had 11 separate recording systems capture it from 11 different stations. Your field recorder's output was one of 12 sources we now have for that conversation. Marsh looked at her levelly. Commander Vale's voice has been positively identified. Creed's response has been positively identified. The content is specific and unambiguous. The coffee cup was warm in Avery's hands. She held it and she thought about what that meant about the transmission she had made from the ridge above Black Ridge Mine in the gray pre-dawn light, the blind broadcast on the guard frequency that she had made because she didn't know what else to reach, not knowing that 11 recording systems were capturing every word. "Where is Vale now?" she asked. Marsh's expression gave her the answer before the words did. The specific quality of careful neutrality that federal agents deploy when a situation has resolved itself in a way that is both satisfying and serious. "Commander Warren Vale was taken into federal custody at 6:14 this morning," she said. At his residence, he had packed a bag. Avery set the coffee cup down. "He knew," she said. "As soon as the transmission went out, he knew it was over." "He had approximately 90 minutes between your broadcast and the arrest team's arrival," Marsh said. "He used them to pack a bag, call 2 people, both numbers are now of significant interest to us, and sit in his kitchen." When the arrest team arrived, he was sitting at the kitchen table. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. She paused. "He asked to see his attorney and has said nothing since." Avery looked at the recorder on the table, at the legal pad where Marsh had written almost nothing, which told her Marsh had needed very little from this debrief, because the evidence already existed in forms that didn't require Avery's testimony to be compelling, though her testimony would make it more so. "How long?" she asked. "How long was he working with Northern Dawn?" Marsh looked at her legal pad. "Our current estimate is 4 years, possibly longer. He used his intelligence liaison role to redirect weapons component transfers, flag operational security vulnerabilities to Northern Dawn before raids, and on at least 3 prior occasions." She stopped. "On at least 3 prior occasions, operations that went wrong in ways that were attributed to other factors appear to have been compromised by Vale's access. 3 prior occasions." Avery heard that, and she sat with it, the weight of it, the specific terrible mathematics of what 4 years of betrayal at that level of access meant in terms of real human consequences. Missions that went wrong, people who didn't come home, families who received flags folded into triangles and were told about operational hazards and enemy action, the specific terrible randomness of combat, and none of it had been random. She became aware that her hands had tightened around the coffee cup, hard enough that the cardboard was deforming. She set it down. "Is there anything else you need from me today?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She was making it steady. "Not today," Marsh said. "You'll be needed for formal testimony. The investigation will take time. Vale's lawyers will be formidable." She paused. "The recording is central. You should know that." "The recording was an accident," Avery said. "I pressed record and I didn't know how much I'd captured." "The best evidence usually is," Marsh said. Avery stood. Her shoulder reminded her it was there. Her ribs made a secondary comment. She acknowledged both and kept moving toward the door. "Chief Petty Officer Kane," Marsh said. She turned. Marsh looked at her with the expression of someone who has spent a career evaluating people and is performing that evaluation now with specific attention to detail. "Off the record," she said, "speaking as one person to another, not as an agent to a witness." She paused. "What you did tonight, the decisions you made, the things you held together under the conditions you were operating in, I've been doing this job for 19 years. I've read a lot of incident reports. I've spoken to a lot of people after a lot of bad nights." She stopped there. "Thank you," Avery said, because she understood that was what was being offered, and she received it without deflecting it, because deflecting it would have been dishonest. She went back to the medical wing. She sat in the chair beside Holloway's bed in the recovery room, because he was awake, and the nurses had told her he had asked about her twice while she was in the debrief. She sat in the chair, and he was in the bed with his ribs wrapped and his color returned enough that he looked like himself again, not the self from the mine's control room. Bound to a chair and doing the work of staying alive through sheer deliberate act of will, but the self she had briefed with 11 days ago, focused and direct and present in the specific way that competent people are present. "Vale's in custody," she said. "He received it without surprise." "I know, they told me an hour ago." "How are you?" "Angry," he said, and tired. "Mostly angry." He looked at the ceiling. 14 years. "He was at my promotion ceremony." He stopped, breathed carefully around his ribs. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that it's over." Is it? She asked. He looked at her. There were contractors identified in the module, she said. People who helped Northern Dawn access the weapons components. That doesn't end with Vale and Creed. No, he said. It doesn't. The investigation will run for a long time. He paused. You'll be part of it. I know. That's going to be difficult. Testimony. Scrutiny. People second-guessing the decisions you made. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. You disobeyed a direct order, he said. She met his eyes. I disobeyed a compromised order from an unverified source, she said. That's different. The review board will make that distinction? The review board will make whatever distinction the evidence supports, she said. I'm not going to argue my case by making it sound cleaner than it was. I made judgment calls in a situation where I had incomplete information and degraded capacity. Some of them were right. Some of them were right by a smaller margin than I'd like. He studied her. Which ones worry you? She thought about it honestly. Entering the mine alone, she said. If Mason and Jonah hadn't been in that chamber, if they'd been moved, or if the guards had been differently positioned, I would have been one injured operator against a full Northern Dawn security complement, with no radio, no backup, and 3 rounds. But they were there. But they were there, she agreed. That doesn't make the calculation retroactively safe. It makes the outcome fortunate. Holloway was quiet for a long moment. The recovery room was mostly silent. Around them, monitors, the distant sound of the medical wing's general activity, the specific institutional quiet of a place where people are in the process of being repaired. Daniels, he said. She didn't answer. Is that what you were thinking about when you made those calls? Partially, she said. Not the way I used to think about him. Not as a weight. More like a reference point. A way of asking whether what I was doing was a response to the situation or a response to the guilt. And I think it was mostly the situation, she said. I can't be completely certain. I'm not sure anyone can be completely certain about their own motivations when they're concussed and operating at 3 a.m. with people's lives in the calculation. That's the most honest answer I've heard in a review room, and you're not even in a review room yet, he said. She managed a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was in the same neighborhood. The 4th seal, she said, remembering. At the compound, the drainage culvert. I marked it. Recovery team found him at 7:40 this morning, Holloway said. His voice changed slightly on the information, a specific quality of relief that had been waiting for delivery. Petty Officer, 2nd Class Torres. Blast injury, severe hypothermia, but alive. He's 2 floors up. She closed her eyes, pressed them closed for 3 seconds. When she opened them, the ceiling of the recovery room was the same institutional white it had been before, and the monitors were the same. And Holloway was still in the bed looking at her with the expression of a man who understood why she had needed to hear that before she could fully rest. I marked the culvert because the debris pattern was wrong, she said. Not because I knew someone was there. I know, he said. I want that in the record, she said. I don't want it presented as intuition or special perception. It was evidence analysis. Anyone trained for that environment would have done the same. Kane, he said. What? Stop defending yourself to me, he said. I was there. Most of the night I couldn't be there, but I was there for the parts that mattered. I know what you did. I know how you did it. I know the difference between what you did and what the people who write reports about it will call what you did. She looked at you, saved my life, he said. Simply. Without embellishment, without the ceremonial weight that statements like that sometimes carry. Just a fact, delivered the way facts are delivered between people who have agreed to be honest with each other. You left me clues through an entire mountain, she said. You followed them. She thought about the medical tape on the branch, the boot print in the mud, the letters pressed into the ice. 3 airstrip east. Trust no comms. She thought about what it had taken for him to do that, to be injured and captive and in pain, and still thinking, still believing that someone was coming, and that the information he could provide would matter. You knew someone was coming, she said. Even before you knew it was me. I knew you were alive, he said. She looked at him. How? Because if you'd been in the compound when it went, he said, they would have told me. They knew about the Overwatch element. They would have used it. They didn't, which meant you weren't recovered. Which meant you were either dead or operational. He paused. I've worked with you for 2 years. I know which one I'd bet on. The afternoon light shifted in the recovery room. Outside the window, she could see the edge of it from the chair the Alaskan sky was doing, what Alaskan sky does in the transition between seasons. Building clouds with the unhurried confidence of a system that doesn't need to hurry because the scale it operates on makes urgency irrelevant. She was tired. The kind of tired that exists below the level of body and connects to something deeper, the layer of a person that doesn't respond to sleep alone, but needs time. She would sleep tonight. She would need more than one night. The review board, she said. When 6 weeks probably, after the criminal proceedings get their initial framework established. He shifted slightly, winced at his ribs, recalibrated. I'll testify. You don't have to. I will testify, he said. That's not a question. She nodded. There are going to be people who say you made emotional decisions, he said. People who look at the outcome and see what went right and assume it was luck and sentiment rather than judgment. People who look at a female operator who went after her commander and read a story into it that isn't the actual story. I know, she said. How are you going to handle that? She considered it. The same way I'm handling this conversation, she said. Honestly, with the record I have, not the one I'd prefer. He looked at her for a long moment. When I was in that chair, he said, and Creed was asking me questions I wasn't going to answer, he stopped. The quality of the pause was specific. The kind that means the words on the other side of it matter to the person finding them. I kept thinking about what I'd tell you after. Assuming there was an after. What did you decide? I hadn't finished deciding when you came through the ventilation passage, he said. The ghost of something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but the bone structure of one, the suggestion, which is probably appropriate given how long I've been figuring out the right way to say most things. She didn't say anything. Some moments don't need addition. From down the hall, she heard Jonah's voice, not the words, just the tone, the specific quality of someone who's feeling well enough to have opinions about the food they're being offered, which she took as a positive medical indicator. And Mason's voice answering from somewhere near the nurse's station, the kind of laugh that people produce when relief has finally found a direction to travel in. They were here, all of them, in various states of damage and repair, in various relationships with the pain that the night had distributed among them. But here, in the same building, under the same roof, breathing the same institutional air. She became aware of something loosening in her chest. Not dramatically, nothing about the night had been dramatic in the way that stories are dramatic, with clean peaks and obvious pivots. It was slow and quiet, the way real things resolve, the way genuine relief feels, not like a surge but like a slow returning, the way blood flow returns to a limb that has been pressured too long. Her radio chirped. She had kept the handset clipped to her vest, even in the medical wing, which the nursing staff had objected to, and she had declined to change. She looked at the display. Base frequency, an administrative transmission. A fourth seal had just been cleared by the medical staff, Petty Officer Torres. He was asking, through the nurses at the station on his floor, whether anyone knew where Chief Petty Officer Kane was. She looked at Holloway. Go, he said. She stood. Her shoulder made its opinions known. Her ribs offered supporting commentary. She moved toward the door with the particular quality of motion that belongs to people who are more damaged than they're admitting, and have decided that admitting it fully will have to wait for a time when waiting is not costing anything. Kane, Holloway said. She turned in the doorway. The module, he said. Marsh told me the contractors identified in the data. None of them are active service members' families. The information Vale feared being exposed was about past transactions, not current operational personnel. He paused. The people we were protecting were never in the direct danger we thought. She absorbed this, thought about the module and what it had meant throughout the night, the thing worth dying for, the thing worth Creed's entire operation, the thing Vale had committed 14 months of betrayal and the lives of 6 SEALs to keep buried. But they needed to know, she said. The contractors, the network. It needed to come out regardless. Yes, he said. It did. Then it mattered, she said. Even if the immediate threat was different from what we understood it to be, it still mattered. He held her gaze across the room. It mattered, he confirmed. She turned and walked down the hall toward the elevator that would take her to Torres's floor, and the click of her boot heels on the tile was the only sound she made, steady and even, the same rhythm she had held through an entire Alaskan night from a broken ridge to the surface of Black Ridge Mine. In the elevator, alone for 31 seconds between floors, she allowed herself to be exactly as tired as she was, not performing function, not cataloging variables, not assessing or planning or preparing. Just a 31-year-old woman who had been awake for 22 hours, through conditions that had not been designed for surviving, standing in a fluorescent box between floors, breathing. The doors opened. She stepped out. Down the hall, a nurse looked up from a station and pointed to the third door on the right. Avery walked toward it. She put her right hand on the door frame and leaned into the room. Petty Officer Second Class Daniel Torres was 26 years old, from a town in Texas that she could never remember correctly, with a blanket pulled up to his chest and monitoring leads on both arms and the specific hollow-faced look of someone who has used a significant portion of their physical reserves and is currently in the process of deciding what they think about that. He saw her in the doorway and something moved across his face that she recognized from the helicopter, from the ridge, and from the mines found Jonah and Mason, the specific expression of someone who has been holding a door shut against everything that the night was pushing against it, and who has just seen that the door is going to hold after all. "Chief," he said. His voice was rough. "I heard you were the one who marked my position. The debris pattern was inconsistent," she said. "Anyone would have checked." He looked at her for a long moment. "The guys are saying you went through the whole mountain alone." "I had help," she said, "from the commander, from Jonah and Mason, from a rescue pilot who decided a lawful order mattered more than an unlawful one, from 11 recording stations that I didn't know existed." She met his eyes. "Nobody does anything like this alone. They just sometimes have to start that way." He was quiet. Outside his window, the Alaskan afternoon was deepening, the sky shifting toward the long twilight that far north latitudes produce in the autumn, the slow, drawn-out ending of the day that gives you time to see it coming. "I was in that culvert for 4 hours," he said. "I didn't know if anyone was coming. I know, I kept thinking." He stopped. "Tried again. I kept thinking about whether anyone would check that section. Whether the debris fall looked wrong enough that someone would stop and mark it." "The fall pattern was wrong," she said. "I saw it." He exhaled. Long and slow and completely. The sound of someone releasing 4 hours of held breath. "Thank you," he said. She stood in the doorway and she looked at this 26-year-old from Texas in his hospital bed with his monitoring leads and his hollow face and the thing in his eyes that had been fear and was now something else, something that would take time to fully name. "Get some rest," she said. "You've got a long debrief ahead of you." He almost smiled. She left the doorway. She walked back down the hall, past the nurse's station, back toward the elevator, and she stood in front of the closed doors and she waited. And in the waiting, she allowed herself something she had been deferring all night, all morning, all through the medical wing and the debrief and the recovery room conversation. She allowed herself to know that it was over. Not finished, the investigation would run for months. The testimony would be difficult. The review board would ask questions she would have to answer with the same honesty she had applied to everything else. And the work of understanding what had happened to the team on a human level, rather than an operational one, would take longer than any of that. But the night was over. The mountain was behind them. Everyone was alive who she had gone into the dark to bring back. She let that be true. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. She pressed the button for Holloway's floor, and the doors closed. And she rode back down in the institutional light toward the people who had come through the mountain with her, toward the long, complicated, necessary work of the morning after. 5:23 a.m. had been the moment they left the mountain. But this quiet hallway, this elevator, this floor-by-floor descent through a building full of people learning to be alive again. This was the moment the night actually ended. She was ready for the morning. She was already in it. She woke on the second day. Not gradually, not with the slow surfacing that normal sleep produces. She came the way she had come awake under the rock and the frozen soil at the beginning of all of it, fast, complete, every system running before she had consciously decided to run them. Her right hand moved toward the rifle that wasn't there. Her eyes found the room's exit points before they found the ceiling. Her body was already cataloging threats before her mind had delivered the information that there were none. Then the hospital room settled into its actual dimensions around her, and she lay still, and she breathed, and she let the sequence complete itself. 2 days. The doctor had told her she had slept for most of them, and she had not entirely believed him until she looked at the window and understood from the quality of the light that it was afternoon, and looked at the date on the monitoring display beside the bed, and did the arithmetic, and found that he was right. Her body had made a unilateral decision about what it needed and had taken it without consulting her, which was perhaps the most honest thing her body had ever done. She lay in the hospital bed and she took inventory. The shoulder was immobilized and throbbing at a level that the medication was managing without fully suppressing, which she found she preferred. She wanted to know it was there, wanted the information even if the information was uncomfortable. The ribs were worse than the shoulder in the specific way that rib injuries are always worse, because ribs are involved in breathing. And breathing is not optional, and every breath is therefore a small, continuous negotiation with the injury. The concussion was quieter. The double vision had resolved to occasional doubling under strain, which the neurology consult the previous morning had called encouraging. The cut on her jaw had been closed with 4 stitches that pulled slightly when she turned her head. She was, in the most accurate available assessment, in significantly better condition than she had been 72 hours ago. She was also in significantly worse condition than she had been before the mission, which was the nature of nights like the one that had passed, and she was making her peace with it the way she made her peace with all the variables she couldn't control, by accepting them as the terrain and beginning to think about how to navigate them. She sat up. The ribs filed their formal complaint. She stood anyway. The neurology consult had been at 9 a.m. on the first day, which she had been present for in body if not entirely in mind. The concussion still doing enough interference that the appointment existed in her memory as a series of impressions rather than a continuous narrative. She remembered the doctor's hands in front of her face, fingers moving, and her eyes being asked to track them. She remembered the question about nausea and her honest answer, and the doctor's expression at the honest answer. She remembered being told that the grade 3 classification was confirmed and that return to duty clearance would require a minimum of 6 weeks evaluation and would not be granted on any accelerated timeline regardless of what her command requested. She had not argued. That had surprised the doctor enough that he mentioned it, and she had told him that arguing with medical professionals about the timeline for neurological recovery was a form of wishful thinking she didn't have the energy for. And he had looked at her with the expression of someone's son who has been doing their job for a long time and has come to appreciate the patients who understand the limits of their own judgment. On the second afternoon, Jonah came to find her. He arrived at her door on crutches, which he was managing with the specific focused energy of a man who had already decided that crutches were a temporary inconvenience rather than a fundamental limitation. His ankle had been surgically reduced the morning after their arrival. The fracture addressed cleanly, his prognosis full return to function within 10 to 12 weeks. "You look better," he said from the doorway. "You look mobile," she said. He swung himself into the room and took the chair beside the bed with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing physical rehabilitation exercises for 36 hours and had started to make the crutches feel like an extension of his own movement rather than a foreign imposition. He was, she thought, one of the most competent people she had ever worked with, and she had worked with extremely competent people. "Mason went home yesterday," he said. His wife drove up from Anchorage. He tried to tell her he was fine. She told him that fine was not an acceptable answer from a man with 2 cracked ribs and blast fragmentation in his face. Jonah paused. He said she was right, but he said it quietly. She felt something loosen in her chest. Not for the first time since the mountain. It kept happening, that loosening. She would be in the middle of a thought or a conversation or a quiet moment and something would shift. Some tension she hadn't been aware she was holding would release its grip slightly, and she would recognize it as the body processing what the mind had been too occupied to acknowledge during the event itself. "Torres," she asked. "Released this morning." His sister came. "She's from Houston. She flew in on 4 hours' notice. She arrived at the best within the speed limit and argued with the gate guard about visitor processing for 6 minutes before they let her through." Jonah's expression had the warm quality of someone reporting news that is specifically good. "Torres said she's been like that his entire life, and he's never been more grateful for it." "Good," she said. And she meant it completely in the simple, clean way that good things are meant when they are genuinely good with no complication attached. She was dressed and in the hallway within 20 minutes. The nursing staff made their observations about this. She made her counter-observations. The exchange was cordial and professional and ended with her agreeing to carry the monitoring unit they clipped to her wrist, which transmitted her vital signs to the nursing station in real time and allowed her freedom of movement in exchange for their ability to know immediately if she was doing something her body objected to at a physiological level. She went to Holloway's room. He was sitting up, his breakfast tray moved to the side table, a tablet open in his hands, with the backlit concentration of someone reading something they find significant. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. He was better, visibly better, the color in his face restored to something approaching normal, replaced by something that was still careful, but was no longer obviously labored. "How's the reading?" she asked. "Preliminary investigation summary," he said. "Marsh sent it this morning." He turned the tablet face down. Sit down, she sat. The chair was the same chair she had occupied 2 days ago. The room was the same room. He was the same person, though the distance between the person in the chair and the person bound to the mind's control room chair felt, from where she was sitting, both enormous and strangely immediate. What does it say? She asked. Vale has retained counsel, he said. 3 of them. The legal strategy, from what Marsh can read of the early positioning, appears to be challenging the chain of custody on the recording and arguing that the satellite terminal conversation was not a direct order to Creed but a discussion of contingencies. She absorbed this. The 11 recording stations. All 11 recordings are being authenticated simultaneously. The chain of custody argument becomes significantly weaker when the same conversation was captured independently by 11 separate systems at 11 separate locations. He paused. The contingency argument is more complicated. His lawyers will argue that authorizing a collateral outcome in a hypothetical scenario is not the same as ordering a specific action. He said everything inside the mine, she said. Creed responded with a confirmation. Yes, and Creed is cooperating, she looked at him. How cooperative? Fully, Holloway said. His agreement with federal prosecutors involves complete disclosure in exchange for custody arrangements that reduce his exposure. His lawyers negotiated it within 36 hours of his arrest, which tells you something about how prepared they were, and also about how much he has to offer. He set the tablet on the side table. He has 4 years of documented contact with Vale. Dates, communications, transactions. He kept records. She hadn't expected that. She sat with it for a moment, the specific surprise of learning that the man who had ordered 6 SEALs killed had been recorded and documented by his own collaborator. Why? She insurance, Holloway said. Creed didn't trust Vale any more than Vale trusted him. He documented everything because he understood from the beginning that a man willing to betray his own service was a man who might eventually find it convenient to close that relationship completely. He was protecting himself from Vale the same way. Vale was trying to protect himself from exposure, she said. Yes, 2 people who trusted each other only as far as the mutual threat held. Holloway's voice had the quiet, sustained anger of someone who has been living with a revelation for 48 hours and has moved past the initial impact into the slower, more durable territory of genuine fury. 4 years, Avery. 14 missions that Command is now reviewing for Vale's potential involvement. 11 confirmed compromised intelligence transfers. 3 operations with unexplained failures that are now being re-examined. 3 operations. She heard that number and she heard everything inside it. The missions she hadn't been part of. The faces she might not know. The families who had been given official explanations that were true on the surface and false at the root. The module, the contractors. 23 names, he said. All civilian contractors with defense security clearances. All of them have been identified and their clearances suspended pending investigation. None of them are current active duty personnel or their families. The threat we were trying to prevent. He stopped. The threat was real. The specific population at immediate risk was different from what we understood. She looked at her hands. At the monitoring unit, clipped to her wrist, its small display showing numbers that represented her functioning body in real time. Does that change anything? She asked. He was quiet for a long moment. It contextualizes the specific risks. He paused. Does it change whether the mission mattered? No. The network needed to be exposed. The module needed to be recovered. People who had spent 4 years helping steal weapons technology from the American military needed to be identified. He looked at her steadily. The mountain needed to be survivable. She held his gaze. The review board date was set this morning, he said. 8 weeks. That was later than either of them had initially been told. She understood what 8 weeks meant. It understood what 8 proceedings had enough early momentum that the military review could be scheduled to follow rather than precede the initial legal framework. It meant Vale's attorneys were managing the timeline carefully, which meant Vale's attorneys were good, which meant the next several months were going to require the same quality of sustained attention she had given to the 6 hours inside the mountain, distributed across a much longer and much less physically immediate set of challenges. They're going to question the order removal, she said, the radio battery. They're going to argue that I severed my connection to Command based on suspicion rather than evidence. And what are you going to say? She had been thinking about this for 2 days. Not obsessively, she didn't have the neurological capacity for obsessive thinking at the moment, which was perhaps the concussion's most useful side effect, but consistently, the way you think about a problem you know is coming, and want to have genuinely resolved rather than rhetorically prepared for. I'm going to say that I received an order from an unverified source using a valid call sign who demonstrated knowledge of my position and injuries that I had not transmitted, she said. I'm going to say that I requested authentication and was refused. I'm going to say that the refusal to authenticate, combined with the content of the order, which was to abandon a confirmed survivor, constituted sufficient grounds to treat the source as potentially compromised. She paused. And I'm going to say that I was right, and that the evidence supports my assessment of the situation, and that I would make the same decision again in the same circumstances. Holloway listened to all of it. Then he said, "That's exactly what you should say." "It's what I believe," she said. "I'm not calibrating it for the board." "I know," he said. "That's what makes it right." Outside his window, the afternoon light was moving in the way Alaskan afternoon light moves in the fall, not toward dark exactly, but toward a diminishment of color, the world turning more neutral as the day progressed, saving its best light for the margins of morning and evening. She had always loved Alaskan light. It had a specific quality of honesty that she found nowhere else, as though the climate had stripped away everything decorative and left only what was structurally necessary. "I want to say something to you," Holloway said. His voice had shifted slightly. Not softer, he didn't operate in registers of soft or hard. More precise, the way someone speaks when they have decided to be careful with something they are about to give. She waited. "When I was in that chair," he said, and Creed was working through his process, "there was a point I'd estimate it was around 2 in the morning, give or take, where I made a calculation." He looked at the window. The calculation was about whether holding out made sense, whether the math supported it, whether the cost of what I was refusing to tell him was being applied towards something that was actually achievable, or whether I was paying a price for a rescue that wasn't coming. She said nothing. "I decided it was coming," he said. "I decided that because I know who my team is, because I know you." He turned from the window. "Not because I was optimistic. Because the evidence of who you are supported the conclusion that if there was a viable path, you were on it." The monitoring unit on her wrist showed her heart rate at 58 beats per minute. She was aware of it in her chest, not racing, not spiking, just present, just beating. "You left me good clues," she said. "You were worth leaving them for," he said. The conversation settled. Not ended, it had the quality of things that had been said and were now being held by both people who had received them, allowed to exist without the pressure of a response. She left him at 4 in the afternoon when the nursing staff came to do his evening evaluation. She walked the halls for a while, which the monitoring unit permitted, and she walked the way she had walked the mine, purposefully, with attention, not fast, but committed to the direction. She thought about Daniels. She thought about him differently than she had thought about him for 2 years. Not as a weight, not as a verdict, more as a part of her history that had shaped the navigation of the night, not perfectly, not without cost, but with more precision than she had previously given herself credit for. The guilt was still there. She suspected it would always be there, in the way that certain experiences become structural rather than temporary, part of the architecture of a person rather than a passing condition. But guilt as architecture was different from guilt as verdict. Architecture you could work with. Architecture you could build on if you understood its dimensions. She had understood her dimensions well enough. The formal review board convened 8 weeks later in a conference room at Naval Station Norfolk. Avery sat at one end of a long table across from 7 officers of various ranks and 1 civilian representative from the Inspector General's office. She wore her dress uniform. She had declined the offer of a JAG officer, not because she was confident in the outcome, but because she had decided that the account she intended to give was not the kind that required legal management. It was the kind that required honesty. They asked her questions for 3 hours and 20 minutes. They asked about the decision to leave the Overwatch position, about the radio battery, about entering the mine without backup, without communications, without authorization, about the shots fired in the control room, about the emergency broadcast on the guard frequency. She answered every question in the same sequence: what she knew at the time, what she assessed from what she knew, what she decided and why, and what she would do differently. On most of the decisions, her answer to the last question was nothing. On the decision to enter the mine alone, she said she would have attempted to contact additional Allied elements before proceeding, acknowledging that the available time may not have permitted it, but that the attempt should have been made. The civilian IG representative asked her, toward the end of the session, whether she believed that personal loyalty to Commander Holloway had influenced her decisions. She thought about the question honestly, in front of all 7 officers and the civilian, without performing the thinking. Yes, she said. The room was quiet. Commander Holloway is someone I respect professionally and trust personally, she said. That trust was part of why I assessed the heat trail and the beacon fragment as worth following rather than potentially worth following. A person you trust represents a different value in a survival calculation than a stranger. She paused. I don't think that's a flaw in the decision-making. I think that's how teams are supposed to work. Trust is supposed to matter. If it didn't matter, there would be no point building it. The civilian IG representative wrote something on his notepad. She couldn't see what. Holloway testified for 40 minutes. He was direct, specific, and without sentimentality. He described what he had observed of Avery's decision-making during the mine, her precision in the control room, the way she had managed the evacuation, the radio transmission on the guard frequency, and he described the context that her decisions existed in, which was a compromised operation run by a compromised intelligence officer in conditions that had made the standard protocol not just inadequate but actively dangerous. He told the board she did not abandon the mission to save one man. She understood that saving her team was the mission. The board deliberated for 2 days. Their findings were delivered in a written summary that Avery read alone in her quarters at 7 p. On a Thursday, with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she was reading. She was cleared of all charges of misconduct. Her decision to remove the radio battery was formally classified as a reasonable response to a compromised command channel under the specific circumstances of the operation. Her decision to enter the mine was classified as within the scope of discretionary judgment available to a senior operator in a field situation where standard protocols had been rendered non-functional by enemy action. She was recommended for the Navy Cross. She read that line twice. Then she set the summary down and she looked at the cold coffee and she thought about everything that recommendation contained, not what it meant for her career or her record, but what it meant as a statement about the night and the decisions inside it and the people who had come through them. It meant the record was accurate. It meant the story the review board had read matched the story she had lived. She drank the cold coffee and she thought about Mason and his wife, about Jonah and his ankle, which he was walking on already, 12 weeks post-surgery, with a slight favor that the physical therapist said would resolve, about Torres, who had returned to his unit and sent her a single text message 3 weeks after his discharge that said only thank you, and to which she had responded with, you held your position, which was the highest compliment she knew how to give. She thought about the 23 contractors whose names had been in the module. She had followed the proceedings through official channels. The way you follow things that matter to you, but that exist outside your direct influence attentively, without the ability to change them, accepting the updates as they came. 17 of the 23 had accepted plea arrangements. 4 were contesting the charges. 2 had entered cooperation agreements that were producing additional information about the weapons component transfer network that went beyond what the module had contained. The network was unraveling. Not quickly, these things never unravel quickly. And anyone who had expected a clean, complete resolution in the aftermath of one night in Alaska had been expecting something that real investigations don't produce. But steadily, piece by piece, the way a structure comes down when you remove the right supports in the right sequence. Vale's trial was scheduled to begin in 4 months. The legal proceedings had been exactly as complex as Holloway had predicted. His defense attorneys doing exactly what well-resourced defense attorneys do, challenging evidence, questioning procedure, attempting to introduce alternative narratives into the frame. The 11 recordings had proven more durable than the chain of custody challenge had anticipated, and Creed's cooperation had provided a foundation of documented evidence that the legal strategy was finding genuinely difficult to address. The trial would last weeks. The outcome was not guaranteed because outcomes never are, but the shape of the evidence was what it was. She had given her deposition to federal prosecutors on a Tuesday morning in October. It had taken 4 hours. She had told the same account she had told everyone, the review board, Agent Marsh, the official investigators, with the same honesty and the same specificity and the same acknowledgement of what she knew and what she had assessed and what she had decided. She had not made herself sound more certain than she had been. And she had not made the night sound more dramatic than it was, which was a more difficult task than it might have seemed because the night had been dramatic in the real and specific way that situations are dramatic when lives are in the balance. But dramatic is not the same as cinematic, and real is not the same as theatrical. And she had spent the entire autumn resisting the version of the story that made her into a solitary hero and insisting on the version that was actually true. She returned to training duty in the new year. Her first day back at the range was a Tuesday, gray and cold, in the way that coastal Virginia is cold in January, not the absolute cold of Alaska, not the kind of cold that accumulates in the bones and becomes part of the physical landscape, but the damp, insistent cold of a coast that can't decide between winter and its own temperate instincts. She drove to the range before the trainees arrived, and she went through her equipment check the way she always went through her equipment check, methodical, complete, not rushed, because rushing an equipment check is a form of wishful, thinking about what you'll encounter in the field, and she was satisfied with what she found. The trainees arrived at 730, 11 of them, various ranks, various backgrounds, all of them selected for the sniper pipeline, and all of them at that specific stage where they know enough to understand how much they don't know yet, which is the most honest place to be in any learning process. She had been there herself 15 years ago, and she remembered it specifically the combination of capability and uncertainty, the awareness of the gap between where you were and where the work required you to go. She taught them about patience that morning, not the theatrical patience of stories, not the waiting as a kind of moral virtue, but the practical patience of applied attention, the patience that comes from understanding your environment well enough to recognize the moment that matters, and having the discipline to wait for it rather than manufacturing a moment that doesn't. She taught them about radio protocol in compromised environments, which was not on the official curriculum for that particular training block, and which she added without announcement or explanation, because the official curriculum had not recently included a situation where the relevant protocol was remove the battery and trust your own assessment, and she had decided that gap needed to be addressed. She taught them about team interdependence, about the specific way that trust functions as an operational asset rather than an emotional condition, about the difference between loyalty to a person and loyalty to the values that make the person worth trusting in the first place. She did not tell them about Alaska. She did not tell them about Black Ridge Mine, or the ice message, or the 3 remaining rounds, or the morning she had climbed out of a shaft into the first light of a dawn that she had not been certain she would see. She did not tell them, because telling them would have made it about her, and it was not about her. It was about the principles she was teaching, which were the same principles she had applied that night, and which existed independently of the specific circumstances in which she had applied them. What she gave them was the thinking, the framework, the way of approaching impossible situations that assumes the impossible is merely a strong challenge and proceeds from there. At the end of the morning session, she had them fire their qualification strings. She walked the line while they fired, watching form and technique and the specific quality of attention that distinguished a shooter who is performing precision from a shooter who is achieving it. She made corrections where corrections were needed, and she said nothing where nothing needed to be said, which is the most underrated skill in instruction. She was at the end of the line when she heard boots behind her. Measured, deliberate, the specific cadence of someone who is walking with intention, but not with urgency. She knew the cadence before she turned. Holloway, in his service uniform, his bearing precise, his ribs healed, and invisible in his movement except for the faintest suggestion of deliberateness on the left side, the residual awareness of an injury that has resolved but left its memory in the body's habits. He walked with the slight limp she had been told about, residual nerve damage from the mine that the doctors expected to continue improving over the following months. He wore it without performance, without accommodation, simply as a current fact of his movement. He stopped beside her at the end of the firing line, and he looked at the trainees working through their strings, and he said nothing for a moment because the moment didn't require it. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, and he brought out something small and placed it on the shooting bench beside her rifle. She looked at it. The beacon fragment. Repaired someone had put the casing back together and sealed it, though it would never function as a beacon again. It was clean and whole, and unmistakably the same piece of equipment she had found in the frost, beside the drops of blood at the edge of the blast site, an entire night and an entire autumn ago. She looked at it for a long moment. "You followed that through an entire mountain," he said. She shook her head. Slowly. The way you shake your head at something that contains a truth, but not the complete truth. I followed the man carrying it, she said. He stood beside her. The trainees fired down the range, the impacts ringing against the steel targets at the far end, each hit producing the specific clear sound of precision finding its mark. It was a good sound. It was a sound she'd spent 15 years learning to produce reliably, and the students at the end of the range were learning the same thing. We're at the beginning of the same long work that had no shortcut and no substitute for the accumulated hours of attention and discipline. I submitted the formal recommendation this morning, Holloway said. She looked at him. Training cadre expansion, sniper pipeline. You'd be running your own section, he paused. It's a 2-year assignment. Your call. She thought about the trainees. About the gaps in the curriculum she had already started filling in. About the specific work of taking someone who is capable and helping them understand how to be reliable, which is a different and more durable thing than capability alone. She thought about the 11 years she had spent building toward a particular kind of individual excellence, and about the night in Alaska that had taught her something she hadn't fully understood before. That excellence without integration is a ceiling, and that the most significant things she had survived because of the people around her and the trust between them, and that the most meaningful contribution she could make was to build that trust in others before they needed it, rather than teaching it through catastrophe after the fact. She looked at the firing line, at the trainees working through their strings with the imperfect, improving focus of people who are in the process of becoming what they intend to be. She looked at the beacon fragment on the bench, small, repaired, permanent. She looked at Holloway. One condition, she said. He raised an eyebrow. The curriculum gets updated, she said. Radio protocol in compromised environments. Independent judgment criteria. Team interdependence assessment. She paused, the full picture, not just the mechanics. He looked at the trainees, then at her, then at something in the middle distance that might have been the future of the work, or the shape of what the work was supposed to produce. Done, he said. She turned back to the firing line. At the far end, one of the trainees put a round into the center of a target at 400 meters, and the steel rang clear across the range, and the sound went out over the quiet, Alaskan-adjacent winter morning with the authority of something that had been aimed at with full attention and had been struck. Status? Holloway asked. She stood at the end of the line with her feet flat on the ground and her shoulder heeled and her ribs no longer making their daily commentary and her vision clean and her hands steady. And she looked at the 11 trainees who were learning to become the kind of people that a team could bet its survival on. And she looked at the range and the work and the long, ordinary, essential morning of it. She looked at the beacon on the bench. She picked it up. She held it for a moment, the weight of it, the specific solid weight of something that had survived a mountain, and then she set it carefully in her vest pocket, close to her chest, where it would ride for the rest of the day. Secure, she said. And that word, that single word that had carried them through the darkness, through the mine, through the mountain, through the morning after, and the months after that, settled over the range in the cold January air, clear and final and complete. It had begun with an explosion in the dark and a woman who refused to wait. It had ended with a word that meant everyone is accounted for, everyone is home, everyone is safe, and the work continues. Secure. That was what it meant to bring someone home. Not the dramatic arrival, not the moment of rescue, not the recording that exposed the traitor or the beacon that caught the fugitive or the shot that disabled the aircraft. All of those things had happened and all of them had mattered, but they were not the answer to the question. The answer was this: a firing range in January, 11 people learning to be trustworthy, a commander who had believed in the cost of keeping faith, a woman who had learned the difference between obedience and loyalty, between caution and courage, between following an order and following the truth. The answer was the ongoing work of people who had decided that no one was expendable and meant it every single day, in every decision, in the unglamorous, persistent middle of a career that would never make the news but would shape every person who passed through it. The steel rang, the morning held. The work went on, secure.